Hello and welcome to My Baseball History. I'm your host, Dan Wallach. My Baseball History is a long-form interview podcast where each episode I'll talk to someone new who has some sort of association to the game of baseball. No matter who I talk to, we'll talk about how they fell in love with baseball, how their career started, and how they got to be where they are today. On today's episode, I spoke with an award-winning American researcher and author who has spent decades learning about and telling the history of baseball in Japan, Robert K. Fitts. A former archaeologist with a PhD from Brown University, Rob left academics behind to follow his passion, Japanese baseball. While living in Tokyo in 1993 and 94, Rob began collecting Japanese baseball cards. He is now recognized as one of the leading experts in the field and has created the e-business Rob's Japanese Baseball Cards, LLC. An award-winning author and speaker, Rob's articles have appeared in numerous magazines and websites, including Sports Collectors Digest, the Baseball Research Journal, the National Pastime, Nine, and on MLB.com. Rob is also the founder of the Society for American Baseball Research's Asian Baseball Committee, which routinely publishes articles and essays studying the history and culture of Asian baseball. But Rob is no stranger to long-form publications. He's the author of 10 books on Japanese baseball and Japanese baseball cards, and those books have earned him some well-deserved recognition. In 2025, Rob was the recipient of SABR's Henry Chadwick Award for outstanding long-term contributions to the study of the game. As you can imagine, for someone who wins what is essentially a Lifetime Achievement Award, winning awards for his research and writing is nothing new to Rob. He won the 2013 Seymour Medal, awarded to the author of the Best Baseball Book of 2012, which was his Bonsai Babe Ruth. He was the recipient of the 2019 and the 2023 McFarland SABR Baseball Research Awards, which honors the authors of the best articles on baseball history or biography completed or published during the preceding calendar year. Rob earned the 2012 Doug Pappas Award for Best Oral Research Presentation at the annual SABR convention for his presentation titled Murderers, Spies, and Ballplayers, The Untold Story of the 1934 All-American Tour of Asia. He's been the recipient of the 2006, the 2021, the 2023, and the 2024 SABR Research Awards. He has been a two-time finalist for the Casey Award, given to the Best Baseball Book of the Year every year since 1983, and he's a two-time silver medalist at the Independent Publisher Book Awards. A popular speaker on the history of Japanese baseball, Rob has spoken at many venues including the Library of Congress, the Japan Embassy in Washington, D.C., the National Baseball Hall of Fame in Cooperstown, the Japan Society of New York, the Asia Society of New York, the Nine Baseball Conference, the American Club Tokyo, and the Society for American Baseball Research Annual Convention, which will be hosted this summer in Cleveland, Ohio from July 29th through August 2nd, 2026. This episode with Rob is unlike any we've ever done in the 5-season history of the show. For those of you who have been around for a while, you know that we are definitely not afraid to have long interviews. I mean, we're no strangers to episodes which last 3+ hours. But this interview with Rob just could not be contained in one episode, so we've broken it up into two distinct parts that are almost exactly the same runtime. The part you're going to hear today will cover the history of baseball in Japan, and the part that will air in the next episode will cover the modern game, basically everything from 1964 to today, with a focus on the in-game experience in the Japanese ballpark if you were going to go there today. But I just felt like we couldn't possibly be well informed enough to have that discussion, to understand the nuance of it all, unless we first learned what came before it so we can truly understand how the Japanese game has evolved. So, before we get to the modern day, we start at the beginning, which means in this episode, we covered lots of ground. Rob tells us about the history of baseball in Japan, which, I promise, is going to surprise you how far back it goes. We find out the significant number of American teams who have gone over to Japan, from amateur and professional teams to barnstorming and all-star teams, and how those teams fared all throughout the 20th century. We learn how baseball cards got their start in Japan, and how the early Japanese cards differ from the early baseball cards in American history. And we hear the names and stories of some of the great players and figures from Japan's surprisingly storied baseball history. With all of that information and much, much more coming at you, it may be helpful to follow along with this episode's liner notes on our podcast website. If you're new to the show, don't worry. You'll still be able to enjoy this episode without the extra help from the liner notes. But longtime listeners love the photos and links we put up on the website, which will give you a better understanding of the things Rob and I are discussing and provide some context when needed. The liner notes can be found on the My Baseball History website, which is online at www.shoelesspodcast.com. If you want to follow along, head to the website where you'll see the Robert K. Fitts episode listed first on the main page under latest episodes. Click on that and you'll be ready to follow along. There's an embedded media player right on the page, so you don't need to have multiple windows open while you listen or fumble around with multiple devices. If you want to catch up on any of our earlier interviews, you can click on the tabs at the top of the website to go back through past episodes from any of our 4 previous seasons and see a full list of everything we have to offer so far. Everything in the liner notes goes in chronological order of how we talked about them in the interview, so you should easily be able to keep your place as you listen. After the interview, we'll do a recap of what you just heard, adding some extra insight and hopefully answering any questions that may have come up as you listened. I'll also explain how you have a couple chances to answer a trivia question to win a prize, so stick around until the end of the episode for that too. But now, here's part 1 of my interview with the award-winning author on Japanese baseball, Robert K. Fitz. So you come from a family who isn't really into baseball. Tell me about how kids playing with baseball cards at school kind of really sparked your interest with the sport.
Yeah, I knew nothing about baseball growing up in my household. My father was an academic, had no interest in sports. If he had any interest, he didn't mind baseball. And in the 3rd grade, what happened, this is 1975, kids were bringing baseball cards to school and they were trading them. And one kid came up with this weird game. Our playground was on this hill, not too steep, but just steep enough. And he would stand at the top of the hill and he'd toss a baseball card. He was actually pretty good at it. And watch everybody else push each other and scrum for the baseball card. I mean, it gave him pleasure to watch us, act like animals, I guess. I enjoyed it. And so I started getting the baseball cards like all my friends. And I was like, okay, what are these? And looking at them and enjoying them. And at that time, the Phillies, everybody knows, was a perennial dogmat team, was finally doing well in 1974 and 1975. They started to win, even though they didn't capture the pennant. They were a good team. And so I'm getting these baseball cards. Everybody's talking about the Phillies. And I'm kind of like, all right, maybe I'll listen to a game or two. And I can't remember when I decided I loved baseball, but it was somewhere during that season. It was fueled by the baseball cards, which it didn't take me long to not worry about this game anymore, to go and start spending all my allowance on the wax packs. And I completed the 75 set. Wax pack at a time and a few friends to trade with. Cool. I remember distinctly that Roland Office was my last card, and it took me so long to find somebody who had it. And Benji, I don't remember his last name, but this guy Benji had one. I think I've traded 20 cards for it, just because he knew I needed it. So that's how I fell in love with baseball. And of course, 1975 was also the Red Sox-Reds World Series.
Yes. And
my family actually watched it. I was so into it that we watched those games together, cool. and that was kind of a magical moment.
You grew up in Philadelphia and then attended the University of Pennsylvania and earned a doctorate degree in archaeology from Brown University. You wrote your dissertation on 18th century New England. And something we like to say on this podcast is that baseball history is American history, and that's really cute to say when the country's 250 years old. But the first human inhabitants of the Japanese archipelago have been traced to the Paleolithic era around 38 or 39,000 years ago. While traditional myths date the country's founding to 660 BC, the unified state known as Japan emerged between the 4th and 6th centuries AD. As someone who loves history, where did you start when you were trying to learn about Japan's past? Because you couldn't learn about Japanese history just learning about Japanese baseball history. So where did you start when you were trying to learn about the whole concept of Japan?
Wow, that's a question I have never been asked before. And I'm going to disappoint you because although I am a historian and I enjoy studying history for fun, I've never been that interested in the history of Japan.
Interesting.
I have to qualify that. I've always, for some bizarre reason, enjoyed studying military history. Now, I was brought up as a Quaker, so that's even weirder. But I have. So I've always been interested in the history of Japan from the samurai period. And I've gone out and visited battle sites, and I try to visit as many castles as possible. So that's something I actually do know something about. But when it comes to the older history, I know very little about. I just know the basics from going to museums. What really interests me in Japan is the transition from the closed society in the Tokugawa period, the samurai period, into when it was opened up by the American battleships coming in 1853. So that whole culture in flux when it meets a foreign culture that's kind of forced upon them, I find that fascinating. So I've done a lot of reading about 19th century through World War II.
Cool. Tell me about Motoshi Fujita.
Oh my gosh, yes. So I bought that card. All right, so backtrack. When you talked about me growing up in like an academic household with no interest in baseball, my father was always a collector. He collected glass and rugs and things like that. But when I started collecting baseball cards for real, and I wanted to go to antique shows and look for baseball cards, he was really supportive. So we would go to a lot of flea markets together, and we were going to the baseball card shows in Philadelphia in the 1970s, which was really, I think there were a few shows in New York, and there were shows in Philadelphia. And Philadelphia had one of the biggest shows. It was only once a year. And I think it was somewhere in the late 1970s, I don't remember the date, I came across a Japanese baseball card, and it was a Fujita. He was a great pitcher for the Yomiuri Giants. He's in the Hall of Fame. I had no idea who it was. I just thought it was really cool, and I don't remember the price. It was probably 10 cents or something like that. So I just bought it and threw it in the binder with everything else. And it wasn't until I was in Japan, I brought it to a friend and said, "Who is this?" And she's like, "Oh, he was the manager of the Yomiuri Giants. You know, he's pretty famous."
Cool.
So I had that. It's not really what got me started, but it's still in my collection somewhere. I think it might even be in a showcase upstairs just because it's got some sentimental value.
Yeah, absolutely. When was the first time you went to Japan, and what prompted that trip?
Sure. So my wife was a Japanese studies major in college. She had spent her senior year in high school in Japan as an exchange student, and she speaks fluent Japanese and did at the time. She's a lawyer. She was about a third-year associate in New York, and one of her clients was a Japanese firm, and she was transferred over there. I remember she went over for a week, and at the end of the week, she's like, "Yeah, I'm going to be another week." And if 2 weeks, she's like, "It might be another week." At the end of 3 weeks, she says, "I think you need to pack a suitcase. We're moving to Japan." So in 93, 94, we stayed for almost 2 years, lived just outside Tokyo and commuted into the city every day. It was wonderful. My very first day when I finally went off to Japan, packed up my suitcase, and I think I had the 14-hour flight. I don't think I slept a wink. I was so tired. I hit that hotel room, exhausted, and my wife's standing there waiting for me with her coat on. She's like, "Get changed quickly. We have tickets for a baseball game, and it starts like in an hour." I'm like, "Oh, no." Well, I go, this Meiji Jingu Stadium in the center of Tokyo, and it's the Swallows versus the Hanshin Tigers. And the Hanshin Tigers fans are crazy. They're so loud. At that time, the Swallows were one of the best teams, so their fans were really into it. And it was a magical moment because you have the fans blowing these horns and banging drums and singing along for every batter, and this old stadium is shaking. And it is, I believe, late April or early May. So the game was two contenders, but it wasn't a playoff game. And I had never seen anything like that. I mean, maybe some college basketball games were somewhat similar, but it is the energy in the crowd was so wonderful. I was like, wow, this is amazing. Second day in Japan, she goes off to work. I decide to go look for baseball cards. You know, show up in Japan. There's museums, there's art galleries, there's all these great things to do. I'm like wandering around town looking, where can I buy baseball cards? I did find a box. And ever since that first day, Japanese baseball's always been a passion for me.
So you had started collecting baseball cards again after Bo Jackson reignited your interest in the sport, and you went to a card shop to buy some 1989 Topps cards. And by 1999, you had an eBay store where you sold Japanese baseball cards. How did you build your card collection in Japan? Like you said, you got that box that first day, but like where were you going? Were there card shops like there were in America, or was it just like you had to go into antique stores and hope that they had a box? Like where were you finding them?
It was a true adventure. So when I was in Japan, I was writing my dissertation. So every morning I would sit down and work. And then about noon, I would go do something else because I'm in Japan. You know, I'm going to enjoy it.
Yeah.
And I would take the train.
You live there now.
Yeah, exactly. I have a lot to learn. So I used baseball as a way to acclimate myself to Japan. I didn't speak Japanese, but I picked up some while I was there. But it was through baseball. So during the afternoons, I would either go looking for baseball cards or go to a ball game, or I played on a baseball team actually there.
Cool.
So I would sometimes go down to the batting cages and practice. So for the cards, it was so bizarre. There was only one baseball card shop in Japan at that time. happened to be a mile from my house in the suburbs of Tokyo.
Perfect.
So one of the things I would do at least twice a week would be to walk down to this card shop and hang out. The owner actually spoke some English, so we could communicate.
Nice.
We couldn't have deep conversations, but we could communicate pretty well. We were a young married couple. We didn't have a lot of money, so I put myself on an allowance. So that was part of the fun is, all right, I've got $20 to spend this week. Let's go see what he has. And as time went on and I started collecting the newer sets, I started getting into the history of the game. My first collection, I had my historic collection back in 93, 94, was collecting the all-star teams of every year.
Cool.
So I would try to go back out to the 1975 cards and collect, who was on the starting lineup of the all-star team. And that's pretty much what I did in Japan because I didn't have enough money to go and really invest in sets. Came back in late 94 and started my career as an archaeologist, and that was my primary focus. But I still cared about Japanese baseball cards, and back then, of course, everything was done by mail, right? So I joined a newsletter, a group. We had about 50 people who collected Japanese baseball cards throughout the whole country. We'd do some trades through the mail and go to card shows, occasionally find a Japanese card. And somewhere, I would say, right before I started my eBay shop, so it must have been about 1998 or so, 99, I put out an ad in Sports Collectors Digest, said Japanese baseball cards wanted. And some guy called me and said, I just bought this whole estate. I've got these boxes upon boxes of Japanese baseball cards. You interested? I don't know what they're worth. And we went back and forth at a price. And I remember his price was very reasonable, but high enough that I couldn't just write a check, right?
The true collector's dilemma.
Exactly. So I agreed I would buy them like one box at a time, and a few $100s a box. And a lot of the stuff I had, or there were multiples, because I was a collector, so I opened up everything that was unopened, right?
Yeah.
And I started, how do I get rid of these doubles? How do I get back this money that I just spent that I really shouldn't have spent? And so the internet basically was just, I don't want to say getting started, but it was starting to get big where like everybody started to have AOL and things like that, right? So I figured out how to get an early website, which was completely static. I set up Rob's Japanese Cards, and then I started doing a little catalog, which of course was made and printed on my home printer and stapled and sent out. It was so much fun. And so I started selling Japanese baseball cards to fund my collection.
Cool.
And yeah, it got reasonably big in the early 2000s with Ichiro coming over. And then I started turning to writing, which I know we'll get to later. But once I started writing, I was like, this is a lot more fun for me than selling cards. So it's kind of, the shop is still in existence, but it doesn't do much now.
Kind of putting those two things together, during the pandemic, you wrote a book called An Illustrated Introduction to Japanese Baseball Cards. As a collector yourself, that's a pretty gutsy thing to do, to inform the general public about the subject that you are actively trying to acquire artifacts from. Was that something you kind of had to wrestle with? Like, how much do I leave out so I can still have a competitive advantage as I continue to pursue my own collection?
I've never thought of that. No. My collection of Japanese cards is fairly advanced. There are things that I don't have that I can't afford that come up, and I'm like, wow, I'd love to buy that, but I'm not willing to spend that much money on a baseball card.
Yeah.
But for the more inexpensive stuff, I have it or I don't want it. So no, that was never an option. And there's a rich history of Japanese baseball cards. There's so many, tens of thousands of different cards, and many of them aren't even cataloged yet. So I gave up long ago trying to get everything that I didn't have. Before I wrote this book, I started focusing on cards that either meant something historically, like was the player important, was it a beautiful card, or was it a rare issue? And so I started buying for that, and that's what cards are pretty much in the book, or I would sometimes even acquire cards for the book once I had the idea. So that's where my collection is now. Like, I haven't bought cards in a while, except last week I found some cards from the late 1940s when Japan had a very short-lived professional women's league.
Yeah.
And I found a couple cards from them, which
Cool.
I picked those up.
And I know that before there were professional baseball teams in Japan, there were early baseball cards of high school and college and amateur players from like the 1920s.
Yeah, the first cards are probably from the late 19th century, but they're just all generic players. I don't think we've ever found one that has a name of a player on it. Starting around, I'd say 1905, you start seeing a lot of postcards. So your first named player cards are postcards, and they were collectibles rather than the Menko cards at the time. So yeah, I have a big collection of those.
I know that's kind of a similar thing in America, and for much of the early history of American baseball cards, they came as a prize inside or were included along with another product, usually food or tobacco related. Do Japanese baseball cards kind of have a similar early history?
Not at all. So this is one of the big differences that I find so interesting is Japanese baseball cards up until very, very recently were associated with children's games. Although I did talk about collectible postcards. Those were collectibles, of course. But the game at the time, starting in the 19th century, is called Menko. And if any of your other listeners out there remember the Pog cat.
Yeah.
You have to be a certain age to remember what Pogs are, right?
I'm that age.
But those are these round discs that kids flipped. And they're all different rules. But usually if it landed on top of another one, you kept both cards. Well, that's based on a Japanese game that dates back into the samurai period called Menko.
Cool.
And so your early baseball cards from the late 19th century all the way through were these Menko. And Menko were originally round, then they became square and different shapes. They were always sold cheaply for kids to play with. And then later on, you start getting something called bromides, which are just photographs, usually printed on a thick paper as opposed to photographic paper, although it can be photographic paper. And those are collectibles. Those weren't played with.
But those weren't only baseball, right? I mean, there were photographic portraits of celebrities, including geisha and singers and actors and athletes. But baseball cards was a subsect of that.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I would say the actor ones were and are still more popular than the baseball ones. Yeah.
Cool. When it comes to collecting American baseball cards, the two most famous and expensive examples are the T206 Hannes Wagner and the 1952 Topps Mickey Mantle. Of course, there isn't a Japanese equivalent when it comes to the financial value, but are there specific cards that are often the Japanese holy grails, which people consider the cornerstones of their collections if they acquire them?
Ooh, good question. Yes. First, I'll say there's one card that we don't think exists, but if it did, it would be the greatest card ever. And there's a pitcher called Eiji Sawamura.
Yeah, we're going to talk a lot about him today.
Okay, we'll talk about him later then, but let's just say if there was a card of him, that would be worth a lot of money. And we'll get back to him then when we talk about him. The other cards that are possible to own, there is a 1958 Jackie Robinson card from Japan. There's other Jackie Robinson cards from 1956 when the Dodgers went over there to play. Mm-hmm. But this Jackie Robinson Menko is an error card. There was a Cuban player named Chico Barbon. He played in 58. He's Afro-Cuban. And when they produced the set, they used Jackie Robinson's image for his card.
Interesting.
And so it was actually pulled. We don't have any records, but we just know it is so much rarer than everything else in the set. It had to have been pulled. Mm-hmm. And that card is shot up in value. I think I bought one for $200 in good condition, decades ago. And now it's many thousands of dollars.
Yeah.
So that's one that a lot of people really want. A card that I don't have and wish I had spent the few $100s way back in 2012 is a Shohei Ohtani signed rookie card, which at times I would never have spent that much money on a new card.
Right.
I wish I had, right?
Hindsight's 20/20.
Yeah, of course.
Okay, so before we really get into things, I know it was helpful for me to kind of lay the groundwork when learning about Japanese baseball by familiarizing myself with some of the common terms. So if you don't mind, can I rattle off some Japanese words or phrases which are common in Japanese baseball and have you give some quick definitions or explanations so we can kind of all get on the same page for the rest of this episode?
Of course.
Cool. So we've already talked about a couple of them, Menko and bromides. What is yakyu?
So yakyu is the Japanese word for baseball, and it technically means field ball. It was coined in the late 19th century. Baseball is also called meizuball in Japanese just as much, but yakyu is the Japanese term that's written in kanji.
You've been a curatorial consultant for the National Baseball Hall of Fame in Cooperstown since 2024, and you helped bring to life the yakyu baseball exhibit, which now resides on the third floor of the museum. What was that experience like for you?
It was one of the highlights of my life. Certainly professionally. I mean, not family-wise, but professionally, I think it was the highlight of my life. It was wonderful.
Did they reach out to you? How did that come to be?
They did, but I know some of the people, some of the curators. I've been giving talks there on and off for at least 10 years, probably longer at this point. And everybody up there is so friendly and nice. So I made friendships up there. So when they were thinking about this, they reached out to me and said, yeah, hey, you want to be involved? And I said, you bet, yeah.
Who would say no to that?
Exactly. I mean, like I said, to be allowed to work at the Hall of Fame is really a dream. Yeah, it was a lot of fun. The team up there is great. Super nice, super smart people who are so passionate about what they do. So to actually be consulted, 4 of us went over to Japan together. The idea was to get the 2 in-house curators really up to speed on Japanese baseball because they've read an awful lot, but they had never seen some games.
Yeah.
So we all went over there. We watched some games. We met a lot of people, which were important for setting up the exhibit and the loan of artifacts. Yeah. And so I think we spent about 10 days together as a group, which was a wonderful experience.
Cool. You wrote a book which came out in 2020 called Issei Baseball, the story of the first Japanese-American ball players, which focuses on Japanese-American baseball and the Japanese-American experience through baseball. What does that word, Issei, mean?
That means first-generation Japanese, basically Japanese immigrant. So somebody who's born in Japan and comes to another country to live is an Issei.
And then kind of along those same lines, then what is Nisei?
Nisei, ni means two, is a second-generation Japanese. So somebody who is of Japanese descent, born in a foreign country.
Okay. Gaijin?
Gaijin is basically, it's used to denote a foreigner in Japan.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And then this is kind of just a broad one. What is the NPB?
So NPB is Nippon Professional Baseball. I think technically NPB was started in 1950, but I'd like to incorporate the league before, which was sometimes called the Japanese Professional Baseball League. That was started in 1936. So I really see them as one league.
And that league is made up of the Pacific League and the Central League, each of whom currently have 6 teams.
Correct.
When we shorten that to the abbreviation NPB, grammatically, does that work the same way as MLB does, where it's not technically correct to say he was the best pitcher in the MLB? Because no, you wouldn't say he was the best pitcher in the Major League Baseball?
Yeah, I think that's right. I wouldn't put a "the" in there. I've heard it done.
Yeah, I mean, people say the MLB all the time. It's just wrong.
Yeah, I wouldn't. It's the name of the league is Nippon Professional Baseball, so NPB.
Cool. What is the best 9?
So at the end of every season, there is an end-of-the-season all-star team. It's a sports writer vote, the way the MVP is. And so each league gives out an award for the best player at each position. And I really wish we'd do that here.
Yeah.
So it's one thing to be an all-star.
Yeah, because the other leagues do kind of do that. Like the NBA, you've got the all-star team, but then you've got all-NBA, first, second, third team. Yeah. NFL is the same kind of thing where you've got the Pro Bowl, which is the all-star team, but then you also have all-pro, which is different. So is this kind of the Japanese version of that concept? That
That's exactly right.
The all-star team is one thing, but then these are the best players?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I would say that although popularity of the player does enter into it, it's certainly not like an all-star where you can get 7 players from one team because of the fan vote. Yeah.
What is the curse of the Colonel?
Curse of the Colonel. All right. So the Hanshin Tigers are like the second city, the Chicago of Japan. Osaka is an industrial town, second largest by far in Japan. Real rivalry with Tokyo. Hanshin Tigers often finish in second place. They historically have had a hard time beating the Yomiuri Giants. So in 1985, the Tigers finally won the Japan Series, headed by Randy Bass, an American, won the Triple Crown. And during the celebrations, there's a canal that runs through Osaka that's incredibly polluted. And during the celebrations, apparently the fans, who were rather inebriated, yelled out like the starting lineup. And somebody who supposedly looked like that player would jump into the canal. So the story is that they got to Randy Bass and nobody looked like Randy Bass, but nearby was Colonel Sanders outside Kentucky Fried Chicken. So they picked up the statue and threw him in, and he sunk to the bottom and couldn't be recovered. That's the story. And then the Hanshin Tigers, who had a great team, did not win the next year. And they did not win for a very long time. I think up until a few years ago, actually. They didn't win the Japan Series again. And so it was known as the curse of the Colonel, that the Hanshin Tigers would not be Japan Series champions until the Colonel's spirit was placated. And they did find the Colonel eventually, and I think they arranged some sort of ceremony, and of course they won the title. Right? It's a silly story, but fun.
I noticed during the 2025 World Series, obviously you've got Shohei Ohtani and a lot of great Japanese players on the Dodgers. And somebody was wearing a Colonel Sanders costume sitting behind home plate, like very clearly on TV. On social media, a lot of people were like, why is somebody dressed as Colonel? But that's why, right? It was the curse of the Colonel.
That would be why. Now, why he was wearing it with the Dodgers World Series, I don't get attention, but that's fun. Yeah, that's really fun.
Okay, and this isn't necessarily a term to know, but just a cultural thing. You very rarely refer to Japanese players by their first name. Why is that?
So that's just not really done in Japan. Just the cultural way of doing things, unless you are really close to a person, and unless that person is very Americanized, you usually use your last name followed by san, which doesn't really mean Mr. It's an honorific for men or women. So if your friends or acquaintances' last name was Tanaka, he would be Tanaka-san. So that just follows suit in Japanese baseball. If you refer to a player whose last name is Tanaka or Suzuki, a lot of times you'll say Suzuki followed by his first name. I mean, Ichiro is Ichiro, so it doesn't count.
Yeah, because that's something I wanted to ask.
Yeah.
So when we called Ichiro Suzuki Ichiro for 20 years, or when we referred to Shohei Ohtani as Shohei, as if they are Cher or Prince, someone who's famous enough to only need one name, but we're choosing their first name, are we being disrespectful?
No. Ichiro became Ichiro when he was in Japan as a marketing thing.
Okay.
Partly because his last name was Suzuki. There's so many Suzukis. Shohei was always, I believe, Ohtani in Japan. I don't know that for sure, though. But he's an American here now, too.
Okay.
And he's got such a distinctive first name, and it just rolls off the tongue, actually.
Yeah.
So I think that's one of the reasons. Yeah.
Cool. All right, we are definitely going to talk about your latest book, In the Japanese Ballpark, but we can't possibly understand why everything you write about in that book is so interesting and how things go to where they are today in the modern Japanese game, unless we learn what came before it. So let's start from the beginning and work our way up to the modern day, okay?
Sure.
Cool. First things first, who are Horace Wilson and Albert Bates?
Okay, so as you probably know, Japan was a closed society during their feudal period at the end of the Samurai Wars for about 300 years. 1853, Commodore Matthew Perry takes what's known as the Black Ships. They're big warships. And he comes into Tokyo Bay and he demands the opening of Japan to foreign powers. Japan quickly realizes we are completely outgunned, realizes the West is gone through the Industrial Revolution and they haven't. And they want to modernize as quickly as possible and become a modern power like Europeans. So they invite thousands of teachers and professionals to come in and advise Japanese people. At the same time, they send a lot of students out to Europe and to the United States. Horace Wilson and Albert Bates are two of these early teachers that came to Japan. Now, Horace Wilson's the one who's credited for bringing baseball to Japan because the story is, first of all, he was from Maine and he served in the Civil War. And he played baseball during the Civil War. Whether he played before the Civil War or not, we do not know. He was a baseball fanatic. And he brought over his bat and balls to Japan when he went to travel. So he supposedly taught his students how to play baseball. Now, at that time, Japan had no organized team sports. Sumo was their biggest sport, and sumo has kind of religious overtones, or at least it did. It still does, but back then it had more. So it was something that was a big sport, but it lacked appeal, I think, than baseball did as a team sport. Once Wilson introduced the game started to be played at the private schools in Tokyo and Kobe, especially, which had a lot of foreigners in them. And it gradually became more and more popular until about 1900 or so, where you could really say it was the national pastime of Japan. It was played in most of the high schools across the country.
Japan's first organized team was put together by Hiroshi Hiroka, an engineer for the National Railways who had returned from America and introduced baseball to his coworkers. We used to think we knew who invented baseball in America and when and where the first games took place. That's why the Hall of Fame is in Cooperstown, for example. But we know for certain that Dr. James Naismith invented basketball. That was a sport that was created out of thin air, so it's much easier to be able to pinpoint its exact beginnings as opposed to a sport like baseball, which kind of evolved from a number of previous bat and ball games simultaneously across the northeastern states. How confident are we about the origin story of baseball in Japan? Like, do we know for certain what you just said is correct? Not to question you, I'm just trying to get this on the record. Yeah,
I'm thinking. I think that's a very good question. The answer is no, because when you're dealing with the earliest, you can always find earlier.
But was it pretty well documented as it was happening that, like, hey, this guy can...
No, it actually wasn't. Well, up until recently, the first, I believe, documented game involving Japanese was, I think, 1876, where we have a box score or a lineup involving Japanese, not involving just Americans.
Yeah.
I believe when I went and looked at it a few years ago when I was writing Issei Baseball, I think for Wilson, the source comes from one of his students many decades later saying, this is where we learned baseball.
Cool.
And I think it's a pretty good source.
Yeah, totally.
It could be wrong, but I think it's pretty good. Now, I was really lucky. I found something just last year that pushed back the date. Now, first, let me say, that several years ago, a fellow named, well, I have to go back yet again, because the origins of baseball is always evolving, right?
Exactly.
Because it's the earliest known game.
Correct.
So a number of people pointed out that there was a game played in 1871 by Americans in Yokohama, where there was a American warship that was actually fighting in Korea. We had actually a little Korean War back then. And it came to Japan to refit, and their crew played the Americans living in Yokohama. So 1871 was like, okay, that's the first known game in Japan. A fellow named Nobi Ito, who is the official historian of NPB, was able to show, although it hasn't been proven, but it's likely to be true, that that same ship stopped in Osaka and played a bunch of Japanese workers and taught them the game in 1871.
Cool.
So therefore, that would be, if we could actually prove that game happened, would have been the first known Japanese game. And then just 2 years ago, I came across this source that suggested that baseball was played in Kobe on the American settlements, Americans against Americans, as early as 1869, which is new information. But once again, it's a suggestion. They said something like, people used to play baseball on this piece of land. So that's all we have.
Yeah.
So it's always changing and developing.
That's the great thing about digging into the history is that, like you said, it's the earliest known, but that doesn't mean that it's for sure the earliest thing.
Exactly.
In 1896, a group of Japanese high school players challenged the American adult players from the Yokohama Country Club to a series and beat them in 4 straight games, instantly becoming Japanese national heroes. And like you were saying, baseball quickly became popular in the elite high schools, and then by the turn of the century, it had spread to major universities. You said that Japanese school teams approached baseball with a martial arts mentality. What do you mean by that?
Well, the theory is that because Japan had no team sports, and the only sports it had were derived from the martial arts, derived from the military, there was, a way to approach martial arts. So they incorporated their way of approaching a sport into baseball. And what that meant was practicing for 2 reasons. One is for absolute perfection, because as we know in the martial arts, there's a great emphasis on form, not just getting it done. So you have to get it done perfectly. The other thing is that very important was the practice to not only increase your skill level, but to increase your spirit. There was a thought in the martial arts that transposed itself into baseball that if you had a stronger spirit, you would eventually overcome in the game. You were therefore stronger than your opponent. So a lot of these practices were emphasized really just tearing down the individual, pushing their limits. And there's quotes that if you weren't vomiting blood, you didn't practice hard enough. I mean, I don't know if that was exaggeration or not, but it is a quote from that time period. And like I said, the idea is if you push everybody to their utmost limit, they'll find a new reserve, a new limit, and get to become stronger individuals spiritually and physically. So that was really the martial arts approach to baseball.
So Robert Whiting kind of talks about that spirit baseball. Yeah. I think you're also kind of referring to Wa.
So I have to admit I'm not an expert on this, but my understanding is the concept of Wa is fitting into society as general. So if you're going to do an action, you think, how will this affect the people around me? How will this affect my community? How will this affect, if I'm on the subway, the people in the car? And that should help you find the right action. So, unlike New York, where there seems to be 200 individuals in your subway car, in Japan, people seem to be a lot more cognizant of what's going on around them and to not be impolite and to affect other people negatively, right? My understanding is that that's kind of the concept of Wa, is to keep everything smooth and so everybody can go about their way in an easy way. Bob Whiting, in his book, You Gotta Have Wa, a wonderful book, talks about that in baseball. His theory was kind of that that's the way baseball goes, that you can't upset the Wa of the team.
So he must have hated the 1977 Yankees.
Well, actually, I think Bob would have loved them. I think, Bob's book, in a way, Bob focuses, and You Gotta Have Wa. I mean, of course, he's still writing now, and things have changed a great deal. But he kind of emphasizes the differences between Japan and the United States, right? That's how the book became a bestseller. And it is a great book. I'm not knocking it. But by looking at the differences, it almost comes out as a negative, right? Yeah. So I think Bob would have loved the 77 Yankees and wish they had played that way in Japan. But I'm just saying that. Maybe Bob would disagree.
When you talk about kind of the martial arts approach to baseball and the focus on form, It seems like many Japanese hitters lift their front leg higher than other countries' hitters, seemingly because they're trying to load their weight into their back leg. In Japanese hitting instruction, loading the weight into the back leg before the stride is thought to be a crucial basic, not only for power production, but also as a timing adjustment against slow breaking balls. When it comes to throwing mechanics, it seems like Japanese pitchers usually produce greater shoulder kinetics, whereas American pitchers generate greater elbow kinetics. Frank Herman, who is a Harvard grad who played 4 seasons for Cleveland and Philadelphia before going to Japan and then playing in NPB, said, quote, "I don't see them training for power or quick twitch. They are more focused on throwing 100 pitch pens, running long distances, and taking 1,000 ground balls than they are on being explosive." It's interesting to me to think that the fact that Japanese players have seemed to latch onto those specific mechanics, most likely because those were the mechanics of the first Americans to teach them the game. And I wonder how the development of Japanese players may have changed over the years if the forms that they were taught originally hadn't been proper, or if they would have continued to try to make those improper forms work because that's all they had been taught as correct, or if they would have tried to alter them until they found mechanics that were more successful. Like, how do you kind of look at that whole concept of the Japanese as a student of the game as opposed to we're going to figure out what works? Is that something you've given any thought?
You know, that's a really interesting, complex question. I have some answers to that, but not from the kinetic side. I think one of the problems with studying international baseball is people fall into a trap of saying people in this culture do X. Mm-hmm. And that statement is partially true, but there's so much variation in Japan, right?
It's like the old stand-up comedy. It's a hack thing to say women do this and men do this.
Exactly.
Like, yeah, generally they might be true, but everybody's got their own thing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So in the 1950s and 1940s, people went over there. American major leaguers went over there and taught Japanese professional players some of the finer points of the game. Many Japanese players adopted that, and many of the coaches adopted that and kept on teaching those points for decades longer than they were used in the United States. I mean, I think that's true, but there were always exceptions. Sadahara O and this back leg flamingo stance came about. It was a purely Japanese development, and it was because O had this hitch in his swing, and he needed to keep his weight back, so they came up with that. And then some people followed him, but the whole league didn't follow him. It was pretty rare to see a flamingo swinger in Japan.
But if he would have batted 140 and had 12 home runs for his career, nobody would have batted like that.
Correct.
It's because he was successful, and people are like, okay, if that works for him, it might work for me.
Correct. Now, one of the things that, we'll talk about this later, but in my new book, when I'm interviewing about 30 different people who work in Japanese baseball, one of the people I interviewed was a trainer. Mm-hmm. And the trainer talked about the different swings. So let me first say that in general in Japanese baseball, they play small ball. So they don't rely on the home run as much as we do in the States. Mm-hmm. There is less power. There's still power hitters there, and there's still people who swing for the moon. But in general, the Japanese hitters tend to have more level swings or swing down on the ball, looking for singles and for balls in the gap. The games are lower scoring. And the trainer pointed out, for example, that there are fewer injuries, oblique injuries in Japan because you don't have that upward angle.
Interesting, yeah.
So that's the generality. But within that, there are still plenty of Japanese players who are following Judge and now Ohtani. They're looking for these obscene launch angles. Yeah. So there's a lot more variation in Japan than a lot of people give it credit to. And let me just throw in that is more so recently. Japanese baseball is transforming and it's changing rapidly over the last 15 years.
In 1905, the Waseda University team became the first of many Japanese teams to travel to the United States. What were those early teams hoping to accomplish by coming to America? Were they goodwill trips? Were they trying to learn about the game and sharpen their skills? Were they trying to play games against American teams just to kind of gauge where they were at in their own development? Like, what was the goal, at least according to people like Isu Abe?
Yeah, the 1905 Waseda tour is really fascinating because they came over for 2 different reasons. One was to learn the skills because baseball was really just getting going in Japan, even though, as I had said, it had been there for like 35 years at that point practically. They wanted to come learn what was known at the time as scientific baseball. And that included boarding spikes, which hadn't been used. Japanese players had previously played in what's called tabi or workman's socks. They are basically 2-toed. They look like a mitten, except they're on your feet. So your big toe has its own hole in your 4 other toes, and they're very thick, and so that you can go out and work on them, and they supposedly give you a better grip than a Western shoe. They used those for baseball prior to Waseda coming over and bringing back spikes. Waseda was interesting because Abe, their manager, was also the founder of the Socialist Party in Japan. He was trained at a seminary in Connecticut, and he really had a view, very much a humanitarian, very progressive. He wanted to bring the world together in peace and harmony. So he went over and brought the team over, not only for baseball reasons, but also for goodwill, which was something that the Olympics started at the same time. And so he was undoubtedly aware of that. So his trip was probably part of the idea of international goodwill through sports that were created with the Olympics.
When the Japanese teams were done with their tours in America and they went back to Japan, were they better at baseball? Like, did those trips to America help them improve or look at the game differently?
Oh, wow. I would think so, but I've never actually gone down and looked at the stats. I mean, during that early period, you had two rival teams. You had Waseda University and Keio University. Keio was quite upset that Waseda beat them to it and went over to the U.S. first. And they immediately went off to Hawaii and trained even harder. And so I think actually Keio, I have to remember my history, but I believe that they actually started beating Waseda because they trained so hard in Hawaii. But both those teams became real powerhouses in that early period. And the other Japanese major universities followed suit and went over too.
In the late 1800s and early 1900s in America, baseball players were usually considered kind of rough and tumble. Most of them didn't have college educations, if they had even completed high school. Being a baseball player wasn't really a well-respected occupation in many cases, and sometimes it was even looked down upon. Has there ever been that kind of same stigma for baseball players in Japan at any point in its history?
Yes, but it's complicated. So in Japan, of course, the high schools played it, but a lot of times...
And not just the high schools, the elite high schools, right?
That's where I'm going.
Yeah.
So a lot of times in the early period, a high school education wasn't mandatory. You had to test into a high school in a lot of places. And so the ones that had the best baseball teams were tended to be elite academic high schools.
Yeah.
So they're educated at a higher level than the general population. And then university baseball, up until the 1930s, was the highest form of baseball in Japan. And these are good universities. So it would be like the Ivy League almost. So you have gentlemen baseball players, but here's the exception. There was a lot of prejudice against professional sports in Japan. The idea that one should not play sports for money. One should play it not necessarily for fun, but because the pure sport was about bettering your body and your spirit. Once ball players turned professional and they were being hired for their pure ability, not for their gentlemanly or not out of their college experiences, there was definitely prejudice looking at those ball players.
Interesting. There was a Japanese barnstorming team called Guy Green's Japanese baseball team who played all across the American Midwest in 1906, who were the first Japanese professional baseball club on either side of the Pacific. Until you wrote about them, they were a team that had basically been lost to the sands of time. How did you rediscover them?
Oh, yeah. Issei Baseball is one of my favorite books, and this is one of my favorite teams. So about 20 years ago, I found a baseball card on eBay that I had never seen before. It was a team picture, and across the uniforms, it said JBBBA. And so I was like, what is this? I have never seen this. It doesn't look to be any team. So I bid for it, and I won it at what I thought was I don't remember the price. It wasn't like free, but it wasn't outrageous either. And I get it, and on the back of it, it says admit one to the Japanese Baseball Separated Assoc game. I was like, oh, it's kind of like a ticket. It's printed on cardboard. So I went out to research it, and I asked some people, including there's a fellow named Kariyo Nakagawa, and he's kind of like the guru of Japanese American baseball. He knows everything. And so he said, yeah, I kind of heard something about that. Here's some Xeroxes that I have in my collection, and it seems to be an early California team. So I put it aside saying, someday I'm going to learn all about this, but I don't have time now. So I went back eventually, and I started studying that team and trying to figure out who was on that team. And I was able to pick up newspaper articles, and this team dated to 1911. And as I found out who was on their roster, I started tracking back the different teams. At the same time, what's going on in my brain is there's a fellow named Goro Mikami, who is known in the literature mistakenly as Jap Mikado. And he was considered to be the first Japanese professional baseball player because he played for the All Nations team. I believe he started, was it 1913 or 1914? I don't remember the exact date he was supposed to have started. Evidence started coming out that wasn't true. There was at least another Japanese player prior to Mikami on this team, and his name was Naito. So I'm researching that, not as a full-time thing, but it's in the back of my mind, when I come across things. Mm-hmm. And I'm researching this 1911 team, and I'm starting to follow back the players, and I see there's a 1906 team as well, where a lot of the 1911 players on there. And they have this fellow named Naito on the team. So it all starts to come together. And this 1906 team is the Guy Green Japanese baseball team, mm-hmm. which I believe, as we said before, the first known professional. Yep. I don't think there's one previous. I really don't. But Guy Green owned the Nebraska Indians barnstorming team, which was, sometimes people call them semi-pros, but these guys chose to be in these barnstorming teams. They signed yearly contracts. They played all season long. They didn't have other jobs during the baseball season, mm-hmm. just like professional ball players. And they would travel around, stopping in every small town and playing local teams and keeping the gate receipts. So Guy Green decides, I want to do that for Japan too, because the Russo-Japanese War had just ended.
Yes.
You also have a lot of cultural arts interest in Japan coming at that time.
Yeah.
And you also had the Waseda baseball team coming in 1905. So Green thinks this is a great time to get together a group of Japanese players. And so he gets a group of Japanese immigrants, and he pretends they're a team that he brought over from Japan. And they travel around the Midwest playing teams. And I want to point out, this will be past tense by the time we air this. Mm-hmm. But next week I am going out to Kansas, where they played their first game. And I'm going to visit the site of the very first game in the small town of Frankfort, Kansas.
Cool.
And April 15th of this year will be the 120th anniversary of this first Japanese professional game. So
Pretty cool.
I'm excited about that.
Yeah, that's awesome. Despite the fascination by many Americans with Japanese people and culture, we're still talking about the United States of America here. So there was still absolutely racism looming, and things like sundown towns existed. Was that something that any of these Japanese teams encountered or were forced to endure while they were here?
I found very little evidence of that, but my sources mostly came from the town newspapers that they visited.
So they're not going to write about how racist they are.
Right.
Yeah. You weren't able to find any accounts of the players themselves, or like player diaries or journals or anything like that?
There's one book that's written in 1954 or 56, don't really remember, that's about these players. And it's not about the team. It's about the guys who are on this team who went on to stay in Japan and were involved in amateur Japanese American baseball for decades. That's a strange book. It's like a hodgepodge of information. And there are, I believe, 5 pages that are a diary from the early beginnings of this 1906 team.
Cool.
And then it just stops. And it's almost like you turn the page going, okay, what happened next? And there's no other page. It just stops, which is so bizarre. And I've actually gone and looked at the notes. So UCLA Library has the notes from the original book, and there's nothing in there either. So we don't have active voices of those players. There's 1 or 2 incidents, I can't remember off the top of my head whether it's 1906 or 1911, where there was scuffles that are reported in the newspapers. And one might guess that was the origins of these. Mm-hmm. But I found no evidence of real bigotry. But I'm sure there was some.
Before World War II, many American teams traveled to Japan to play, from university teams to major league teams to all-star barnstorming teams, even the Philadelphia Royal Giants of the Negro Leagues. But with a 50-plus year head start on the sport, and the fact that until the mid-1930s, baseball is, like you said, primarily an amateur endeavor in Japan, the touring Americans played mostly lopsided games against university and amateur teams. From 1908 to 1934, American professional teams won 87 out of the 88 games they played in Japan, and their one loss, which happened on November 23, 1922, angered Kennesaw Mountain Landis so much that he accused pitcher Wade Hoyt of throwing the game and threatened to stop endorsing American teams' trips overseas. And that game was most likely thrown because the Americans and the Japanese knew that the interest in the tour was kind of waning because the Americans were beating them so badly. So the Americans were like, all right, to get people to keep showing up to these games, we got to throw one and give the Japanese players and fans hope. What can you tell us about some of those early American trips, especially the 1913 World Tour between the New York Giants and Chicago White Sox, or like the Herb Hunter All-Americans in 1920 and 1922?
I think it's important to remember that the early tours of the American professionals were money-making opportunities. They were not goodwill tours.
Mm-hmm.
Now, American colleges, universities, and amateur teams or semi-pro teams are going to Japan every year on goodwill tours and bringing the college students part of their education and making friends with Japanese. And they're going back and forth. Japanese teams are coming to the U.S. too, college teams. So there are purposely at the collegiate level making goodwill tours and exchanges of ideas. But professionally, they're looking for money. These are barnstorming teams.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one thing to remember. The 1913 tour seemed to be fairly well organized because it was part of this world tour.
Mm-hmm.
They only stopped in Japan. They played two games.
That sounds right.
Japanese really enjoyed seeing the major leaguers. There's a lot written about it, but not as much as the later tours. But when you look at 22, 20, especially 20, a lot of these tours were very poorly organized.
Mm-hmm.
And the Japanese still enjoyed seeing the major leaguers, but they were not goodwill.
I was actually under the impression that America's relationship with Japan from the late 19th century through the 1930s was pretty rocky. So, one, whose idea was it for these trips to take place? And then two, how were they allowed to?
Well, once again, we're looking at great variation of ideas between countries, right? So there have always been Japanophiles in the United States, and there have always been American files. I'm not really sure what the word for that is in Japan. And there have been plenty of Japanese who went to college in the United States and spoke pretty good English. And baseball has been a uniting factor between Americans and Japanese really back until the 19th century. So Japanese who are into baseball generally had closer ties with the U.S. than the general population, or more importantly, the politicians. So even at times when the politics were rocky, baseball teams were allowed to go back and forth. And people within the Japanese political structure, a lot of them did play baseball. A lot of them went to these top colleges where, like Waseda and Tokyo University and Keio, where baseball was really the sport. So there was a lot of love of baseball even at the top until we start getting really into the 1930s.
Kind of like how the 1992 Summer Olympics in Barcelona with the Dream Team playing was the line of demarcation for international basketball taking the next big step. That's what the 1934 Major League All-Star Tour to Japan was for baseball in Japan. There's a very clear shift between before the tour and after the tour, which is actually a tour that you wrote another book about called Bonsai Babe Ruth. Before you tell us how that tour changed baseball in Japan moving forward, can you tell us who some of the Americans were who went overseas on that trip?
Sure. So let me tell you how it was organized to get to that. So in the late 1920s, a guy named Matsutaro Shiriki buys a newspaper called Yomiuri Shimbun, the Yomiuri newspaper. And it's a good newspaper, but it's like ranked number 3 at the time. And he's a very directed man. He wants it to be ranked number 1. And he figures out the best way to do that was through entertainment. And he sets up all sorts of sections. I think there's a section on Go, and a section on Mahjong, and things on theater, and things like that, and in sports. Mm-hmm. So he sets up a tour in 1931. And the tour is of American All-Stars and includes Lou Gehrig and Lefty Grove and Mickey Cochran, Al Simmons. I mean, a whole bunch of Hall of Famers go over. And they do great. And the Japanese love them. Of course, they dominate. But people just love seeing them. But they didn't have Babe Ruth. And Shiriki really wanted to have Babe Ruth over. So he sets up another tour. He does this through a fellow named Lefty O'Doul. Lefty O'Doul comes over to the 31 tour. I think he's a batting champ, National League batting champ. So he's a star. He falls in love in Japan during 1931. Absolutely adores it. He goes back in 32. And he helps set up the 1934 tour and gets Babe Ruth there. So on this team, at first base, you have Babe Ruth, a little different. Charlie Gehringer's at second base, Jimmy Fox at third base. In the outfield, you had Lou Gehrig, because they let Ruth play first base, Earl Averill, and Bing Miller, who was an all-star and a great center fielder. So you really have a fabulous team there. And
but they could have brought 8 guys like you and me as long as they had Babe Ruth on the team, and people would have been thrilled with it.
Probably, but the Japanese Shiriki really wanted to bring stars. He wanted to make his newspaper number 1, and he pretty much was already there after the 31 tour. So he really wanted to wow everybody. So they come
But it wasn't just that he was promoting the tour, is that he was giving his own newspaper exclusive access to cover these games.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Oh, it was brilliant, right?
Yeah.
I mean, he paid for everything and paid well. But yes, he got all the money in return and got exclusive access. And so parts of the whole newspaper were there. There were giveaways in the newspaper. There's this gorgeous team picture of both teams taken together that's a giveaway that's highly sought after today and out there on the collectibles market. And yeah, it was great. So the team goes over there, and the Japanese fans just go crazy. That he said there was 500,000 people lined up the streets of Tokyo to welcome the team when they landed in Yokohama and took cars up into their hotel.
I mean, as long as we're going to talk about how excited the fans were, can you just explain what the title of your book, Bonsai Babe Ruth, means? Like, what does that phrase translate to?
So bonsai is an expression that literally means 10,000 years. So to yell bonsai or to say bonsai, it's an exclamation you would do maybe at New Year's, but more like a toast or at a big party, or
it's like saying to good health, essentially, but
sort of, yeah, but and then some,
Yeah.
right. So that's what bonsai means. So the idea was when Ruth was going through Tokyo that the fans were yelling, cheering, and that some of the things they would yell would be bonsai, 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 Babe Ruth, supposedly.
Cool.
So that's where the title comes from.
In November of 1934, a group of army officers who were kind of on the outside decided that they wanted to overthrow the Japanese government and bring back far-reaching societal reforms and reforms to the military. How did learning about that provide you with what you needed to write a compelling book? Because it's one thing to just write about this baseball tour, but your book kind of has three parts. One of the parts follows the baseball team. Another part follows the army officers who were attempting a coup d'etat, which I'm allowed to talk about. And then the third part is kind of about a right-wing, almost a terrorist group that ends up trying to assassinate the organizer of the tour, Shiriki. You kind of alternate chapters between those storylines, which builds a really interesting tension, and I think makes Bonsai Babe Ruth a much more interesting book than it would have been if it were just a book about the baseball tour. Why was it important to you to create that entire world and not just write about the baseball aspect of the story?
Exactly. So what happened was I was looking for a topic to write a baseball book about. I had written a book called Wally Onamine first. Actually, I had written 2 books on Japanese baseball before that, but I was kind of searching for another one. And somebody suggested the 34 tour because it changed Japanese baseball. And I said, yeah, it's so interesting, but it's just a baseball tour. How am I going to tell a story? It wasn't, well, they went to this and they played a game, and then they went to this game and they played a game, right? And so I'm just reading background. I think my wife, from the time she was a Japanese studies major, which I mentioned earlier, had a biography of Tojo lying around the house, left over from college. And so I'm like, I might as well read it. It's here, right? It's a pretty good book, actually. And I'm reading this, and I see something, like a throwaway sentence in 1934 that talks about this possible coup. And then in a footnote. And I quickly turned the footnote, and it mentions that there was this possible coup in November 1934 that never got off the ground, and it wasn't even known about until the war crimes trials after World War II. And I'm like, that's a story. That's a book. Now it's not just a baseball book. So I think we were on vacation like the second I got home. No, I didn't even bother the internet. I went right to the archives. And I'm like, I started learning all I could about this abortive coup. And then I realized right away, I have a story here. And one of my favorite non-baseball books is Devil in the White City by Eric Garson, right? And for the readers who don't know this book, it follows 2 paths. One is the creation of the World's Fair, 1890, right?
1893 in Chicago.
Yeah. And the other is the serial killer Holmes. I forget Holmes' first name. Do you?
H.H. Holmes.
And it alternates chapters between these 2 stories, which kind of overlap. Yeah. So once I heard of the coup, I was like, all right, this is my favorite book, and I can really follow suit. And then I bumped into more information on the right-wing terrorist group, which attempts to assassinate Shiriki. Of course, the assassination was well known, but I found out a lot more information by digging a little further, mostly through secondary sources, because one of the joys and challenges of writing Bonsai Babe Ruth was getting into the academics and re-entering my past, where I call up university professors who have been studying this and say, hey, I'm a baseball writer, but this is a lot deeper than baseball. What's been going on in the field? What are you guys studying? And they say, this is actually a terrorist group. And so I got a lot more information from people who I wouldn't have come across normally. And that led to the different plots.
Who were the Americans playing against on this tour?
Well, this is really important because previously on all the other tours, the Americans played against colleges. Remember I said earlier that in Japan there was kind of a prejudice against professional ball players?
Yeah.
So there was a movement at that time. What's going on in the collegiate sports is a lot of what's going on right now in the U.S. sports is the college players are pretty much outgrowing college. They're not there for education. They're there to play baseball in Japan. And some of these guys stayed like 7, 8 years. And these are future Hall of Famers because that's all they could do is play baseball.
Right.
I mean, they take one course a semester and they play baseball for as long as they possibly could. And so the purists in both academia and also in academic baseball, this has to be reformed. So they came up with a rule that basically said, if you play against a professional, you are ineligible to play collegiate sports. And they did a lot of other things to try to bring collegiate sports back into the college. So Starinsky needed an opponent for this team, and he couldn't use the colleges, so he had to form his own team. So what he did is he went out and formed an all-star team. And he recruited some players away from high school and away from colleges. And then he went back to a lot of these, we're going to call them professional collegiate players, who had been playing 7 years or had recently graduated and were now playing for semi-pro teams, which they did have in Japan. And he created a team called the All-Nippon team, All-Japan team.
On November 20th, 17-year-old Eiji Sawamura pitched 7 shutout innings before surrendering a home run to Lou Gehrig, losing the game 1-0. Sawamura actually had a no-hitter through almost 5 innings, and by the time the game was over, he had struck out 9, including consecutive strikeouts of Gehringer, Ruth, Gehrig, and Fox. What can you tell us about Eiji Sawamura and his legacy in Japan?
Yeah, he's a fascinating individual. The truth is he's not a fascinating individual. His story is fascinating.
Yeah.
So he is a high school kid. He's pitching for a high school in Kyoto, and he's a phenomenal pitcher in high school. Starinsky manages to get him to come out and pitch for the All-Nippon team, and he has to give up his scholastic career and no chance of going to one of the top universities. But he kind of figures this is his chance. He's pitching against Babe Ruth, and he's a pitcher. He's not really a student. So he joins his team. And I believe it was his second or maybe even third outing. And he didn't really do that well in his first one. I mean, he's just a kid. On this particular day, the sun is right in the batter's eyes, right over center field, coming in low in the late afternoon. And it works for both pitching. Whitehill pitches for the All-Stars, the American team. And he actually outpitches Sawamura. Because nobody can see anything. But Sawamura does have enough guts to stick in there and to challenge the hitters. I mean, he must know what's going on. And he goes for it. And he pitches his wonderful game. Now, what's interesting about Sawamura, as like I said, not necessarily a person, but he becomes a symbol. And right away, he becomes a Japanese hero for holding the Americans down. And even though he lost, he came so close. He's seen as a symbol in the future of Japan. If this 17-year-old kid could be gutsy enough to almost beat the mighty Americans and to strike out Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig, etc., Japan could do that too. We could be gutsy enough to be a world power and to be right up there with the Americans and the British and the Russians. He goes on and becomes a great professional baseball player. And he serves 3 tours in the Japanese army during World War II. And what's interesting is because he's a hero and a symbol of Japanese baseball, when he joins the army, he's actually a lowly infantryman, but he supposedly is writing articles about the war. Now, I'm pretty sure they're ghostwritten, but I don't know how much of his own opinion is in these articles. I don't think anybody really knows. And he becomes very pro-Imperial Army, very pro-Japanese military, very anti-American. His articles that are published during the war, supposedly from the front lines, are all full of fictitious American atrocities, real propaganda pieces. So once again, he's used as a symbol.
Do you know if they had interaction during the 1934 tour? Like, how did he feel about the American team? And based on what you know about his relationship or lack thereof, does that lead you to believe that those articles were ghostwritten if he was saying such negative things about Americans when his only experience with Americans would have been theoretically so positive?
Well, this is interesting because he actually had more experiences with Americans. I don't have much information about 34, about what Sawamura thought. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. What's important to answer the question is in 1935 and 1936, Sawamura goes back to the U.S. as part of barnstorming teams, which become the Tokyo Yomiuri Giants.
Yeah.
So he ends up spending 2 summers in the United States, all over the country. And supposedly during that experience, he really doesn't enjoy the United States.
Okay.
How much of that is later propaganda? How much of that? I don't know. But that's what we think we know. So he's very negative during World War II. And then he gets killed during combat.
Yeah.
His troop transport gets sunk. And what's interesting is he becomes a third symbol after the war because he becomes a symbol of what Japan lost during the war. The greatness the war cost them. It's an anti-war message. It's like, we would have been great. We would have been a world power if only we hadn't gone the destructive way because the flower of our youth was destroyed.
As a pitcher, Cappy Hirata said that he had a fastball that hopped all over the place and compared him to Roger Clemens. He's one of just 2 pitchers in Japanese baseball history to throw 3 no-hitters and the only one to do so for 30 years. He's one of just 6 numbers to be retired by the Yomiuri Giants in their history, and the award for the best pitcher at the end of the season is named after him. Like we have the Cy Young Award, theirs is called the Eiji Sawamura Award. What were the crowds like on that 1934 tour, and how were the games promoted and advertised?
Well, they were pretty much all sellouts. I mean, my understanding is there were crowds outside the stadium who couldn't get in, so they just waited outside the stadium and listened, and then cheered when the ball players finally left, an hour after the game or whatever. They didn't have clubhouses, so they probably left immediately after the game. They were promoted through the Yomiuri newspaper. I have seen subway signs for sale.
I meant more like, was it come watch Babe Ruth play baseball, or was it come watch our great Japanese all-stars play against this Americans? That's what I meant. How was it framed?
That's a great question that I don't know the answer to.
Because you tell a great story about how they convinced Babe Ruth to come over.
I was just going there.
Yeah.
So to answer your question, I'll first tell the story, right? The story goes, so they went over in October in 34. So somewhere prior to that, Shiriki's right-hand man, a guy named Satoru Suzuki, who's responsible for actually making sure the tour happens. And he's like general manager of the American team. He comes to New York to finally make sure everything works. And he hears this rumor that Babe Ruth has decided he's not going to go to Japan. Because Babe Ruth had just pretty much parted ways with the New York Yankees.
Yeah, very unceremoniously.
Yes,
Yeah.
He wanted to manage, and the Yankees said, no way. And he basically said, well, then I quit. And they said, well, we weren't going to hire you anyway. A typical child men, right?
Yeah.
And so Ruth is in this foul mood. And Suzuki's trying to contact him, and Babe Ruth is dodging Suzuki. And he finally gets a tip-off that Ruth is going to get for his weekly haircut and shave. And he goes to this barbershop near his house up the west side of New York. And Babe Ruth's sitting in the chair, and Suzuki goes in, and Suzuki speaks fluent English and has met Babe Ruth before. Suzuki's trying to talk him into it, but he's like, no. And finally, supposedly, Suzuki's about to give up, and he reaches into his briefcase and pulls out a full-size advertising poster where Babe Ruth's face covers the poster. And it says U.S. versus Japan, and it's all, and I think it even says Babe Ruth Home Run King or something on it. And it's a wonderful picture. It's actually on the front of my book. Ruth supposedly starts cracking up and says, okay, yeah, I'll go. I'll go. So, yes, to answer your question, Babe Ruth's front and center. What the headlines in the newspapers say, I don't remember, but there was a lot of giveaways in the magazines and in the newspapers, and Babe Ruth's photo is usually on the front. It's on the front of the program. It's on the front of the advertising poster. It's on the front of several other giveaways that were put in the newspaper. So, yeah, he was the drawing card.
So how did Babe feel about Japan itself during and after the tour? The people, the atmosphere, the food. I mean, he's so famous for how much he loved to eat and drink in America. Did he have those kind of same experiences in Japan?
Babe Ruth loved Japan. Absolutely loved it. He thought the food was some of the best he ever had. He thought the entertainment was great. He went with his wife. So though people would always talk about Babe Ruth's other appetites, he probably didn't indulge those in Japan, but he had a great time. He really did. He just loved the Japanese people. He loved to be the center of attention, and he was the center of attention. And like I said before, he really enjoyed the food, and Babe Ruth loved food.
And he played great.
Oh, he played fabulously. He led the team in home runs, RBIs. I don't think he led it in batting average. I'm trying to remember. We could look it up easily enough, but yeah, he was the best player of the tournament.
7 years after that 1934 tour, the Japanese bombed the American naval base in Pearl Harbor. Can you talk a little bit about how that affected the players and Babe Ruth specifically?
Sure, yeah. At the end of the 34 tour, it went so well that the Americans involved really thought that they had single-handedly brought the two countries together. Connie Mack, Babe Ruth, even the ambassador to Japan came out with statements in the press and said, the mutual love of baseball has reunited our two countries. There will not be a war. We can avoid conflict because we're two united people in love with the same game. And they really people believed back then that sport, and especially baseball, was part of our national psyche, part of our national spirit. So if you could understand and love baseball, Americans thought you are okay. And the United States always had this strange relationship with Europe, and Europeans didn't like baseball, so we didn't quite trust them. Right? But Japan loved baseball. So the players on the team really felt betrayed with Pearl Harbor, the way many Americans, of course, did, even ones who didn't know anything about Japan, but people who were involved in Japanese relations felt extraordinarily betrayed. Babe Ruth went on a tear. I think he lived on the 7th floor in his Riverside apartment, and a big apartment, and it was decorated with Japanese antiques and tchotchkes that he picked up in Japan. Yeah. And supposedly I know this from his daughter, he threw open the windows and started tossing out the vases and everything onto the sidewalk below, cursing up a storm about the Japanese. And his wife and his daughter are like trying to save the best antiques and things so he wouldn't throw them out. Yeah. And then he went right to work, working for war bonds and raising money to fight Japan.
And didn't he himself buy like $100,000 worth of war bonds?
I think so, yeah. Yeah, because he felt so betrayed, he really wanted to stick it to Japan.
Yeah. A story that many people are tangentially aware of, but may not realize that this is when it happened, is the story of Moe Berg. What can you tell us about Moe and what he did on this U.S. baseball tour of Japan in 1934?
Yeah, what a great story.
And how it kind of contradicts what the general consensus is, because you have learned that the way that story has been told is not quite exactly probably how it happened.
Yeah, the myth of Moe Berg is as interesting as the real story, right? I mean, fascinating guy. Okay, so Moe Berg, of course, was a catcher, played during the 20s and 30s, graduated from Princeton. He also attended the Sorbonne. He attended and eventually graduated from Columbia Law School. Very bright man. Gift for languages. There's a very famous joke, which I just have to tell it. Yeah. Apparently one player said he could speak 12 languages, but he can't hit in any of them. Yeah. Right? He was mostly a backup. He was an incredible defensive catcher, but he really had trouble hitting at the major league level. So he was kept around to teach the other catchers and to back up whenever they needed it. He went to Japan in 1932 on an exchange trip that was organized by a fellow named Herb Hunter. And they brought Ted Lyons over. Ted Lyons, a Hall of Fame pitcher with the White Sox, and Moe Berg was his roommate on the White Sox. And Lyons said to Hunter, you know what, who should we bring along? We should bring along Moe Berg. He can speak any language. He's really smart, and he's a great catcher. And he can help teach the Japanese colleges how to be a great defensive catcher. So he goes over in 32. He loves Japan. When the 34 team is being organized, he wants to go back. And so they bring him along, and there's actually a little bit of back and forth. Moe Berg says, I want to go. And then he's like, yeah, I don't know if I really want to go. And they say, yeah, you got to go. You really need to go. He's like, okay. So it's not like people have told him to go, or like he's like, I'm going. He goes back where he wants the cultural experience. Yeah. That's important because Moe Berg eventually becomes an operative for the OSS, which of course is the forerunner of the CIA. OSS was created after World War II started, not before, and that's important. So he goes on the tour in 34, and he brings a movie camera, and Moe Berg really behaves strangely. He takes lots of pictures in Japan, but not just of street scenes and the ball fields. He takes pictures of military installations. And there's a famous story where there's a big sign that says, no photographing, people will be detained if you take pictures. So he takes a picture of it. And we know for a fact, because the film survives, that at one point in the tour, he said he was sick, and the team went off to an away game. He stayed at home in the hotel, and he sneaks out of the hotel, and he climbs the tower of the St. Luke's Hospital in Tokyo, takes out his camera, and films the skyline of Tokyo, and then goes back. And why he does that, we don't know. So a lot of people have assumed that Moe Berg was a spy during World War II. Moe Berg, later in his life, he was a very odd man. He liked mystery, and he liked to create mystery. So when people suggested he was a spy during World War II, he never said no. Apparently he would wink, right? And he never said yes either,
Yeah,
right?
Yeah.
So there's all these stories about how he was a member of the OSS, which did not exist during this tour, and he was put on the roster to spy on Japan. Now, tensions between Japan and the U.S. in 1934 are really high. And there are people who think they might be in war in 1936. Mm-hmm. So it's not crazy that we as the U.S. would be spying on Japan. We were. We had a bunch of military people already over there taking pictures and infiltrating to the best of their ability Japanese military sites. So there wasn't really a need for Moberg. Nicholas Davidoff has written a book called Catch You as a Spy, fabulous book. He went back long before I wrote my book, and he's studying Moberg's legacy. And he said, I can't find any evidence that Moberg was actually a spy at this point. If anything, the evidence, the circumstantial evidence contradicts it. So I went back into the declassified archives. I looked at the ambassador to Japan's declassified correspondence. Mm-hmm. I went into Moberg's declassified correspondence, anything I could find. And you'd certainly think if Moberg was a spy, there would be something in there that'd say, hey, check out this guy Berg. There's nothing.
Interesting.
Nothing at all. There is a letter that Moberg had from his congressman to whom it may concern, please show Moberg the greatest courtesy possible or something like that people say, oh, this is evidence. And it's not. This was done back then.
Right, yeah.
People had letters of introduction. So my research and Davidoff's research shows, I think pretty convincingly, that Berg was not a spy in 1934. My theory is he's a strange guy.
Yeah.
And he was spying on his own, and that's when he decides, this is really fun.
And it's interesting to me that he had also gone in 32, because one of my favorite stories about Moberg is that when they get on the boat, Babe said, hey, Mo, do you speak Japanese? And he said no. And then they get off the boat and he greets the people who are greeting them in perfect Japanese. And Babe goes, you lied to me. And Mo said, no, you asked me 2 weeks ago. I didn't know how Japanese back then. But if he had gone to Japan 2 years previously and knew that he was going on this trip, first of all, he probably already knew it. And second of all, he would have learned it leading up to the trip, not on the boat on the way there.
Well,
so A, is that story just completely made up? Or B, was he lying to Babe Ruth because he liked this mystery and he liked to mess with people?
I don't know the answer to your very good question. The copy of his book survives and his notes survive. In the New York Public Library, there's a Moberg file. And you can actually see notes that he took to himself in Japan and on the trip. Mm-hmm. And he is practicing his vocabulary while he's on that trip. So it is possible, but I think he would have known the basics.
Yeah.
But he certainly was brushing up during the long, it's a 2-week boat ride,
right?
Totally. So he's using that time to brush up on Japanese, yeah.
After the tour, instead of breaking up the Japanese team, Shiriki kept them together and created the Yomiuri Giants, like we talked about, who have been Japan's most successful and popular team, winning 30 pennants and 20 championships since 1946, including 9 straight from 1965 to 1973. They've also produced some of the best players in Japanese baseball history. Who are some of the most famous Yomiuri Giants of all time?
So I think we have to start, for Americans, the most famous of all time is Sadahara Oh, the great home run hitter, played from 1959 to 1980. And he had a teammate that's not as well known among Americans named Shigeo Nagashima. And he was the third baseman, MVP player.
And he's considered Japan's greatest player, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
There are reasons for that. There are many reasons for that. He was a great player. I mean, he hit home runs. He won batting titles. He was a superb defensive player, all-around player. He also had a charisma. He is a little bit like Shohei Ohtani in that he was very good looking, movie star looks, and he played with a passion that wasn't seen as much in Japanese baseball. They weren't as robotic. Boy, that sounds horrible. But in the 1980s, you started to see a very robotic way of playing in Japan with not that much passion. In the 50s, there was more passion on the field. But Nagashima always played with passion, and it made him extremely popular. O is Taiwanese, born in Japan, but with Taiwanese descent and with a Taiwanese passport. Nagashima was Riko University, all university player, pure Japanese. So there was always that kind of national prejudice, I guess, for Nagashima. Mm-hmm. He was the all-Japanese boy, just like Americans love Mickey Mantle because he was the all-American boy.
Blonde hair, blue-eyed.
Yeah. So he was like the equivalent of Mickey Mantle, I think.
Yeah, Sadahara Oh made his professional debut on April 1st, 1959. He started his career as a pitcher, but wasn't very successful in transition to first base. Oh has the most home runs in professional baseball history with 868. He was an 11-time Japan Series champion during his playing career and won the NPB Triple Crown in 1973 and in 1974. He holds the NPB record for the highest OPS at 1.079 and is first in runs batted in at 2,170. He was inducted into the Japanese Hall of Fame in 1994. And he was a great home run hitter, but his home run total kind of overshadowed his all-around skill as a hitter. He was a .301 career average hitter. He had 5 batting titles. He had a .446 on-base percentage. Like I said, in his 22 seasons, his team won the Japan Series 11 times. And then Nagashima, his teammate, from 1958 to 74, Nagashima won 6 batting titles, ending his career with a .305 batting average with 444 home runs and 2,471 hits, which is good for 9th all-time in Japan. He hit at least 25 home runs in 12 different seasons. For much of their career, Nagashima and O were the unstoppable dynamic duo.
The O and Cannon.
Compared to the crushing 3-4 combination of Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig of the 20s and 30s, the Murderers Row Yankees, the MVP in the Central League was won by either Nagashima or O every year from 1963 to 1971. With O batting third and Nagashima batting cleanup, the Giants absolutely dominated baseball in Japan in the 60s and 70s. Nagashima's teams won 11 Japan Series championships, including 9 in a row, and he was the Japan Series MVP 4 times and the league MVP 5 times. So 2 just great players. Like you said, in 1936, 7 teams formed the Japanese Professional Baseball League and played a series of tournaments. In 1937, an 8th team joined, and the league played its first full season of pro ball. But World War II decimated Japan and, in turn, baseball in Japan. So what happened in 1949 as an attempt to boost morale?
So baseball was back, played an all-star game in October of 1945. So they brought professional baseball back as quickly as possible to build morale in Japan. But of course, morale was still low. Country's infrastructure was decimated, as you said. There was poverty, there was disease. Slowly started to build back during the occupation. But in 1949, with morale low, I'll tell you the story. There's a fellow named Kappy Harada. He's very, very important Japanese baseball.
Yes.
He's amazing.
He seems like he's the Japanese Forrest Gump.
Yes, he is.
He's just like involved in every big thing that happens in Japan baseball history, and even some random things like being involved in Marilyn Monroe and Joe DiMaggio's honeymoon.
Yes.
Like, yeah, so talk about Kappy Harada.
Is amazing. Now, Kappy was very, very good at self-promotion. So people have told me take some of his stories with a grain of salt, but I actually believe he was pretty important. He's very important. Mm-hmm. So Kappy was a Japanese American, brought up in California, but he was bilingual. And he joined the U.S. Army during World War II as an intelligence officer. He was actually sent behind the lines in New Guinea. And then with the occupation, as a lieutenant, he joined MacArthur's occupation headquarters, GHQ, right? He was part of the economic development team, and he was put in charge of Japanese sports. So the story is there's a big general staff meeting headed by MacArthur and the other generals, and Kappy's in attendance. And they're talking about the lack of Japanese morale. And Kappy supposedly stands up as the lowly lieutenant and says, if you permit me to speak, I think baseball is the way to rebuild Japanese morale. And I think we should bring a barnstorming team, just like they did with Babe Ruth, to help reunite the two countries through baseball. Supposedly, MacArthur says, well, what are you sitting here for? Go to it. And so they go back to Lefty O'Doul, who we talked about earlier. Like I said, he loved Japan. And O'Doul had actually went over in 1946. As soon as the war was over and it was safe to travel, he paid his own way over to Japan to look up Shiriki and his friend Suzuki and all the other friends he had made prior to the war, and see how they were doing, to see if he could help financially, whatever it took. And he was involved in reestablishing Japanese baseball from behind the scenes right away in the 40s. Kappy looks to O'Doul. And at that time, O'Doul is managing the San Francisco Seals in the PCL. And he says, Lefty, would you come over? And Lefty, of course, says, of course we will. So he brings over the San Francisco Seals.
Was Lefty so ready to accept that offer because he wanted to help Japan rebuild, or because he just wanted to be in Japan again, or was he trying to get promotion for the San Francisco Seals? Like, why was he so thrilled to participate in Japanese baseball? Because his name is one that is littered throughout the 30s, 40s, 50s even. Why did he care so much about baseball in Japan?
I think he really loved the Japanese people. He enjoyed Japan so much, and it wasn't like he was into Japanese art or history. I mean, he kind of was, but I mean, he really enjoyed the relationships with people. So these were his friends, and he really believed, I think I can say this, I don't think he's ever really written on it, but I think he kind of believed in the power of baseball to bring people together. because he was always organizing these goodwill tours.
Yeah.
And he called them goodwill tours.
Yeah.
So he brings over the SEALs, and he does a whole bunch of things that are aimed at goodwill. First of all, they don't make money. They purposely said, we want to cover our expenses. All profit we get, we will donate to Japanese amateur baseball to rebuild the fields, to bring equipment over, and to set up the leagues. So that's pretty remarkable.
Yeah.
They did other things. For example, we'll start with the biggest event. The biggest event happened on opening day. They have a mixed crowd of many GIs and some Japanese, but tickets are a little expensive. So it's probably a mostly American crowd at first. They play the U.S. national anthem, then they play the Japanese national anthem, and they raise the flags together. This is the first time since before the war this is ever done.
Right.
And Cappy Harada, in full uniform, in the box seats, stands up and salutes both flags.
Right.
It brings the Japanese in the audience to tears. It's such a moving statement. The symbolism is we are now allies. We're now on the same side. Mm-hmm. It brought a lot of flack for a lot of the GIs sitting in the stands.
Yeah.
But MacArthur immediately comes out and makes a statement is, not only do I approve it, I applaud it, and I gave it my permission. And so this symbolic statement is so important in bringing the countries back together. But O'Doul did a bunch of other things. I'll just name a few. There's two I'll talk about. One is he gave free tickets to a school of war orphans. I'm sorry, they were blind or orphans, or even worse. Yeah. And I think almost everybody else would have put them up in the bleachers. Instead, he gave them box seats and brought them right down to the players. And that was noticed by the Japanese people in press and talked about as what a statement. And then at the end of the tour, he decides to hold one more game. There was something that he did called Kids Day in San Francisco, where he either brought in the kids for free or sold the tickets like it cost and brought in food and let the kids run the bases. So he decides purely for goodwill reasons to do that in Japan. And he has a Kids Day. So he packs the stadium with kids. Mm-hmm. They sell Coca-Cola, which is quite a luxury item, and they sell it basically at cost. So even though it's a lot of money for most of these kids, they share it if they can.
Yeah.
You know, they try some American hot dog, for example, and once again, it's a symbolic statement that means the world to the tens of thousands of kids, but the press picked it up as well.
Yeah.
The baseball tour really did help reunite the two countries and really did help rebuild some Japanese morale because they said, we have a future here. We can have a future with the United States as an ally and a friendly country, not just as an occupying country.
Yeah. So then in 1950, Japanese professional baseball reorganized and adopted a two-league system like we have with the American League and the National Leagues here in the United States. 7 more teams were added to form the Central League and the Pacific League, with the winners of each league meeting in the Japan Series for the championship. Do the Central League and the Pacific League play by the same rules as one another, or are there any differences, kind of the way that the National League didn't have the DH for years while the American League did, or anything similar to that? Like, do they play the same game, or are there differences?
I believe for the first 23, 24 years, they were basically the same rules. And then the Pacific League went out and adopted the DH. So the Pacific League has never been as popular as the Central League. When they divided up the teams, they kept the Yomiuri Giants and the Hanshin Tigers in the same league to keep that rivalry going. Mm-hmm. And these two teams have historically made up for like 90 or 85% of all Japanese fans, right? Yeah. And so that was by far the more popular league. And because they didn't have an equitable draft back then, and some people say they still do not, the Tigers and the Giants got more than their fair share of the great rookies. Mm-hmm. So they tended to have the better teams in the early period. Although if you look at the winner of the Japan Series, it's a lot closer than you would think.
Yeah.
So the Central League was always seen as the more popular, more senior, more prestigious league. So that's why the Pacific League went out and adopted the DH, because they wanted to have more offense. They wanted to increase fan attendance. The Central League finally blinked, and in 2027 will adopt the DH now that both major leagues do it.
Interesting.
And I just want to say I actually enjoy watching pitchers strike out. I mean, I really do. I think I'm against the DH still. Yes, there's more offense, and watching a pitcher strike out or not even swing the bat is kind of lame. Mm-hmm. But I really, really enjoy the strategy of what do you do in the 8th inning down 1-0? Yeah, take out your starter or...
If pitchers are making it to the 8th inning, sure. But
They are
the
in
way,
Japan.
Yeah, in Japan, right. Yeah. But in America, if a pitcher is getting pulled after 4 innings anyways...
It's moot at this point,
yeah,
right?
The game has just changed so much.
Yeah. And I think that's partly in there with the batting. Because
totally.
if you're not worried about running through your bench, why not just change the pitcher all the time?
In 1951, the Yomiuri Giants signed the first American player in Japanese baseball history who's another person that you've written a book about. Who was that player, and why was that such a bold move at the time?
Sure. The player's name is Wally Yonemine. Wally's a fascinating guy. He's Hawaiian, Japanese. His family actually comes from Okinawa. He was a Hawaiian superstar high school athlete. He was an incredible football player. Also one of the best basketball players and one of the best baseball players on the island at that time. And he signed a professional football contract with the San Francisco 49ers. This is back in 47, right? Mm-hmm. And so he's probably the first Japanese American to sign a professional football contract. I believe there are a couple other Chinese Americans around the same time. They expected him to be a superstar because he was that good in Hawaii. But it never really clicked for some reason. He was a very young player. He did not attend college. He went right to professional football after a little bit in the Army, I should say. And it just didn't quite click. And then they hired a replacement player whose name was Joe Perry. He's in the Hall of Fame. This is pre-NFL. 49ers, of course, went on to join the NFL. And so Wally switched to baseball. He actually broke an arm playing baseball in the off season. And so he couldn't really recapture a spot on the 49ers. So he switched to baseball because back then, Japanese baseball is kind of a small community. Who does he reach out to? Lefty O'Doul. And Lefty O'Doul signs him for the San Francisco Seals, and they move him down to the minor leagues. And he plays a season for the Salt Lake City Bees, and he does very well. Will he be a major leaguer? Maybe. Some people say he would have been. Wally says, no, my arm wasn't strong enough to be a major leaguer. I was good, but I might not have been that good. Because back then, of course, he only had 16 teams, right? He would have been eligible as a Japanese American, but it would have been a very difficult climb, and some teams might not have wanted him on the team, may not have been willing to take a chance on the Japanese. So anyway, O'Doul gets to him and says, I've got an opportunity. Would you like to go to Japan? And so what's going on at the same time in Japan? 1950, as we've already talked about, you get a split with the Central League and the Pacific League, and the Yomiuri Giants do not win the pennant. And they are not in the first Nippon series, and they are upset.
Yeah.
And they have a great team, but they just didn't make it. And they're like, okay, we've got to be the champions. And Cappy Harada, once again, back to the same small circle, he is now advising the Yomiuri Giants. And supposedly he says, maybe it's time to bring in an American. And they're like, yeah, well, we do not want a blue-eyed, blonde-haired, 6'5" American in the middle of Tokyo. That would not go over well with our fans. Cappy supposedly says, what about Japanese American? They start working the circles. Japanese American baseball people in Hawaii, Lefty O'Doul, Cappy, they all kind of are talking. And they come up with a bunch of names, and one of them is Wally Yonemine. And they offer him the job to come over in 1951 to the Yomiuri Giants. And he goes over there and he changes the way people play baseball.
So tell me about what kind of baseball player he was, and what was the reaction of Japanese people when they saw him play?
Well, as I said before, he was a former professional football player. Yeah. He's not a big guy. He's 5'9", 165 pounds.
But he had that football player mentality.
Yeah, and he had to build. I mean, compared to the other Japanese professional players, I mean, he's stocky.
Yeah.
And he's strong and fast. So he goes in there and he's very aggressive. In his very first at bat, he gets brought in as a pinch hitter, and he decides to lay down a bunt for a hit. So he lays down this bunt and he goes barreling up the line for a safe hit. And people are like, whoa, what just happened? We don't see that back then. You see safety bunts, that's what Japanese called sacrifices, but all of a sudden he's on first base. And then when a ground ball comes, about to turn to double play, he takes out the second baseman. The second baseman was like flying into the left field. And that was not done. Period in Japanese baseball. That was considered dangerous and rude, and people were booing Wally, and he becomes kind of like unpopular. But the Giants love it. The Giants are like, this is what we need. We need aggressive playing. This is American baseball. Let's adopt it. And the Giants, the traditional Japanese team, are at the forefront of bringing over American players. And they bring over 4 Hawaiian Japanese players in the next few years. And Wally goes on to become a Hall of Famer and then stays as a coach and a manager for years. And the Giants are built their 1950s teams around Japanese American players.
Yeah, Wally's hustling style led to a .311 lifetime batting average, 3 batting titles, 7 straight selections to the best 9 team from 1952 to 58, the 1957 Central League MVP award, and he was a member of 4 Japan Series championship teams. He was an outfielder from 51 to 62, and then a coach or a manager from 1963 through 1988 for a handful of teams, winning the Central League pennant in 1974 as a manager of the Chunichi Dragons. Wally said that when he was a little kid growing up in Maui, he used to listen to Honolulu High School football games and the Hawaii League baseball games on the radio. Were games of the Japanese pro teams broadcast on radios in the mid-20th century like Major League Baseball games were here in America? Is that one of the things that kind of helped the following become so widespread? Or how were people consuming Japanese baseball without being in the stadium?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know that answer definitively, but I do know famous Japanese radio announcers.
Okay.
So there must have been
Totally.
Japanese baseball radio. There had to have been.
And similarly, do you know of any television broadcasters?
Not until later.
Yeah.
I do know that. I can't give you the first date, but I'm pretty sure that was much later in the 50s. Yeah.
Was Wally's signing tantamount to Jackie Robinson breaking the color barrier in the major leagues, or is that kind of overstating it?
I would say that's overstating it. As baseball writers, we have a tendency to overstate things. Mm-hmm. It was big, but he was of Japanese descent. Mm-hmm. And Wally came straight out and said, even though people, including me, like to call him the Jackie Robinson of Japan, he said, no, Jackie had it much rougher than I did. I looked like a Japanese. I wasn't attacked the way he was. Mm-hmm. Now, he was attacked for being a Nisei because the more traditional Japanese felt that the Nisei should have sided with the Japanese during World War II. Mm. So he did face some discrimination and some hostility for that. But Wally's own words, is not in the same way that Jackie felt.
In 1952, 11 foreigners joined the league. In 1953, 13 more came over. Most of the early foreign players were Japanese Americans, but not all of them. The Hankyu Braves, for example, recruited 4 former Negro League players. The foreign players had an instant impact on Japanese baseball, and in 1954, Larry Raines, who was a former Negro League player and future major leaguer, won the batting title by hitting .337 with 18 home runs, 38 doubles, and 96 RBI, adding 45 stolen bases in just 137 games. To limit the effect foreign players would have on the Japanese league, what did they do?
Well, they put it in quota system. They didn't want the teams like Hankyu was not a powerful team. Mm-hmm. It was a lowly team, and so they made a deal with Abe Saperstein of the Harlem Globetrotters, and they brought over these former Negro League players, and they were good players.
Yeah.
Fascinating story. Unfortunately, all the players passed before their stories were truly recorded, because I think that would have been a fabulous book, and other people have thought it would have been a fabulous book, but the stories just aren't there to tell the story.
What a shame.
Yeah.
During the 1960s, teams started importing AAA players and former major leaguers, so the league reduced the number of foreign players allowed from 3 per team down to just 2. In the early 1980s, Takezo Shimoda, a former ambassador to the United States and Japan's one-time baseball commissioner, said Japan should purify the game of gaijin, making only Japanese players eligible. How close did that come to actually happening?
Yeah, well, the Tokyo Giants, the Yomiuri Giants, did that first. So as we just said, during the 1950s, they were kind of the proponent of bringing in the Japanese Americans, and it led to many championships. Their best player during the 50s was their first baseman named Tetsuhara Kawakami, who is known as the God of Batting, which is a play on his last name. Kami means God. He became the manager, and he was a strong proponent of having an all-Japanese team. And he was also a rival of Wally's. The two of them didn't get along all that well. So Wally was kind of towards the end of his career. Sadahara O came in at the same time at the end of Wally's career. And so Wally mentored O to take over his position, really. Kawakami kind of pushed Wally out. So Wally moved to Chunichi Dragons. And at the same time, they had another Japanese named Andy Miyamoto, who was a home run hitter. Kawakami pushed Miyamoto out as O came into his stride, so became the power hitter. So the Yomiuri Giants had a non-foreigner team. They had O, who was of Taiwanese descent, and they had a few players, I believe, of Korean descent, but they were born in Japan as far as I remember. and they were the best team. So people thought that's the way the league would go. Now, it's not all racism. I mean, it's often portrayed as, the Japanese are so racist and they wanted no foreigners. One of the things they wanted to do was to promote the local talent. So when they challenged the major leagues, they would have homegrown players. They would have stars. And they felt if they were importing all the stars from foreign leagues,
It's not as impressive.
it's not impressive, but there's also an inability to grow your own stars. So it is a different philosophy.
I posed the question on Reddit, what do you already know about baseball in Japan, and what do you want to know, when I was preparing for this interview, because I didn't know a lot about Japanese baseball before we agreed to do this. And a lot of the people commented about the movie Mr. Baseball, where Tom Selleck plays an aging American baseball player who loses his roster spot and is traded to the Dragons. Then he falls in love with the manager's daughter, and it's a classic fish out of water story with some great baseball sequences. Do you think that movie's a fair representation of Japanese baseball and Japanese culture, at least maybe at that time?
It's a fair Hollywood representation. How's that for a Weasley answer? Yeah, I mean, some of the things that happen in that movie are true. Now, so the story behind the movie that I got from one of the players who was playing at that time was that the writer or producer, I don't remember which, came over to Japan to watch some Japanese baseball games and to do a little research. And he met with the foreign players. The foreign players would meet at this restaurant after the games almost every night. And so they brought the writer along, or producer, and talked to him about the movie. And they started telling stories. And the guy who, we'll call him the producer, said, oh my God, this is even better than what the script is. Right? So he rewrote the script and included a lot of these real stories. And that's the story I've been told. So what is portrayed on the field is reasonably accurate for that time. It came out in the 90s, early 90s,
early
but
90s,
we're really talking about the 1980s through early 90s. Now, as the players would say, all those stories didn't happen to one player. Right. They're an amalgamation of what happened over 20 years of collective memory.
Right.
So,
Players like Greg Boomer Wells and Tuffy Rhodes have gone over to Japan and had very successful careers, and their success is often cited as what must be the low quality of play in Japan. But there have been plenty of former major leaguers who have gone to Japan and failed. Larry Doby, Joe Pepitone, Bill Madlock, Jesse Barfield. What kind of American player is the type who is most likely to have success playing in Japan? Is it a specific style of play? Is it a specific body composition? Is it a certain mentality? Like, what Americans succeed in Japan? Is there a trend or a certain mold that normally succeeds there?
That's a great question. And I ask that question of former players and front office people all the time. And the answer to the front office people is always a smile and say, well, if I knew that, right?
Yeah.
The most important thing is mental attitude. Being able to deal with Japanese baseball, which is putting aside a lot of your privileges of being a major leaguer. For example, in Japan, even I believe up till this day, but at least as of 5 or 6 years ago, you carry your own bags to and from the stadium. A lot of the stadium clubhouses do not have showers in the visiting clubhouse. So you change and you shower in your hotel. You get the bus to the stadium, and then after the game, you go back to your hotel where you're allowed to shower. That really gets on the nerves of some former major leaguers. Right? So you are treated a little bit more like a minor league player in terms of the perks in Japan. So you have to get over that. You have to deal with isolation. That was a bigger problem back in the day. Now, of course, with the internet and international phone calls and a lot of Japanese speaking English, at least passable English, the players are not as isolated as they used to be.
Yeah.
But they used to be very isolated in the 70s and early 80s.
Totally.
You have to get over that. You have to get over the different style of Japanese baseball and the small ball. Now, on the diamond, in general, Japanese pitchers will pitch towards the corners. You'll see a lot of breaking pitches. They pitch what used to be called backwards, which is you get into a hitter's count, 2 balls, 0 strikes. You're likely to see a curveball on the outside corner, not a fastball down the middle. They'll start often with curveballs and set up the fastball, as opposed to the U.S. where they start with the fastball and set up the curveball. Once again, changing in both leagues now. So you have to get into that mindset, be able to do that. Sometimes when they import a major league star who's a known fastball hitter and known for hitting high fastballs, I smirk. He's not going to make it. Right? You got to be able to adapt and not swing for the fences.
Yeah.
But every now and then, there's always those exceptions, right, to prove the rule.
To celebrate the 150th anniversary of Japanese baseball, the Society for American Baseball Research published Nichibei Yakyu, U.S. Tours of Japan, which is a 2-volume book which talks about more than 100 baseball teams from the United States and Hawaii who have crossed the Pacific to play baseball in Japan. It's the first book written in English to focus on these international tours, and one of the things that fascinates me the most is that this wasn't something that just happened in the early 1900s and into the 1920s. There were multiple major league teams for decades who would make trips to Japan in the offseason or in the spring. The Yankees in 1955, the Dodgers in 56, the Cardinals in 58, the Giants in 60, the Tigers in 62, the Dodgers again in 66, the Cardinals in 68, the Giants again in 70, the Orioles in 71, the Mets in 74, the Reds in 78, the Royals in 81, the Orioles in 84. What were the goal of those trips? Were they covert scouting operations? Were they an attempt to gain fans in an international market? Because it's not like there was the internet or anything, or even retail sales for most of those years. So a Japanese person being a fan of an American team, whatever that meant at that time, it wouldn't have even really translated to any dollars. So what was the goal of the major league clubs when they went on those trips during that time?
So the goal of those tours was international goodwill. At times that meant political goodwill during the 1950s when we were in the early 60s actively involved in wars against communism, and we needed as a country diplomatically to keep Japan as a strong democratic ally. Okay. As time went on, that was not as important.
Let me stop you for a second.
Sure.
Was the American government behind this? Were they offering or suggesting to major league teams, hey, you need to do us a solid here? Because what would have been in it for the Baltimore Orioles to be a diplomatic ambassador for, like what?
I really don't know the answer to that question. The U.S. government was always involved in some way. Whether that was really pushed in the 1950s, I don't know. My feeling from what I read was it didn't come from the U.S. government. It came from baseball people, but the U.S. government jumped on board very quickly. When you deal with the later points, like the Baltimore Orioles, we're talking about baseball exchanges of goodwill between the leagues.
Yeah.
The idea to grow the game, to get Japan stronger in baseball, to make baseball a more international product. But baseball was not as big a business as it is now. So the idea of the Orioles going to Japan in 71, they wouldn't sell enough memorabilia. They probably barely even brought memorabilia to sell. That was just about growing international relations between the two leagues.
Interesting, yeah.
Yeah, and plus it was all expenses paid trip to Japan. And,
right? If I'm a player, of course I'm going.
Yeah.
I just don't understand. Major League Baseball is so famous for everything better make me money or I'm not doing it. I just don't get really how that would have made them money.
My opinion, and it's just that, was that's a more recent development. That although baseball has always been a business, and we should never forget that, back in the 60s and 70s, there were enough people who really enjoyed international baseball, believed in baseball as the greatest sport, and wanted to promote it. That's what was behind those tours. That's my opinion.
Okay, we've mentioned a couple already, but let's talk about some of the other all-time great players in Japanese baseball history. Victor Starfin, who was born in Russia, was nicknamed the Blue-Eyed Japanese. He had 83 career shutouts, giving him the NPB record. He was 42-15 with a 1.73 ERA in 1939, starting 41 games and completing 38 of them. In 1940, he went 38-12 with a .97 ERA in 436 innings, completing 41 of the 42 games he started. He was actually put in a detention camp during World War II due to intense xenophobia and died tragically in 1957 during a mysterious car accident. Cappy Harada said that he would pitch 5 or 6 days in a row and that one time he pitched 40 innings straight. What can you tell us about Victor Starfin?
Well, that's such a wonderful story. I mean, his family came over from Russia, escaped from Russia during the revolution, and there's all sorts of tales about them hiding in a wagon full of corpses to get over the border.
Wow.
I mean, it's fabulous stories. There's a movie out that people can watch, a documentary about him that's worth everybody's time to watch. So he comes over, his family comes over, he settles in Hokkaido in the north of Japan. He is much bigger. He's over 6 foot, much bigger. The average Japanese size before World War II was 5'3" for a man, and he's 6 foot something. So he dominates schoolboy baseball. Shiriki wants him on his team in 1934, and he doesn't want to go. He wants to attend, I think it was Waseda University. He wants to become a baseball scholar, and do both, and really get set up for Japanese life. And Shiriki wants him really badly. And it so happens that Victor's father owns like a tea shop or something, some sort of cafe. And he's having an affair with a Russian waitress.
His father or
His
Victor?
His father. And there's an argument, and he kills this Russian waitress, and Starson's father is put in jail for murder. And Shrieky is an owner of the Yomiuri newspaper, a very powerful individual. And he works out a deal that the father will get some sort of clemency if Victor will join the All Nippon and then the Yomiuri Giants. So Victor basically feels he has no choice and joins the team. And then, as you said, he becomes really the best pitcher in Japan. People like to focus on Eiichi Sawamura, but if you look at the stats, you want Victor Starfin on the mound for you.
But he wasn't Japanese.
Exactly. And, of course, he's put into detention camp. He has a problem with alcohol. He ends up dying in an alcohol-related car crash. But he is truly one of the great early Japanese baseball stars, yeah.
Masashi Kaneda debuted at 16 years old and pitched until he was 35. He was nicknamed the Emperor due to his dominance on the mound. Kaneda is the only player to win 400 games in NPB history, and he ended with exactly 400. But what's even more impressive is that he played for an absolutely terrible team for most of his career, the Kokutetsu Swallows. To give you an example of how bad the Swallows were, they didn't have a winning record for the entire decade of the 1950s. Despite that, Kaneda won at least 20 games in 14 straight seasons from 1951 through 1964, and he led NPB in strikeouts 10 times. He also won 3 straight Eiji Sawamura awards from 1956 to 58. He was a 3-time ERA leader during his 19 seasons and pitched 2 no-hitters and a perfect game in the same season in 1957. In 1965, he moved across Tokyo to the significantly better Giants and helped them win 5 Japan Series championships in a row until his retirement in 1969. In addition to the record 400 wins, he also holds the complete games record with 365. He has the strikeouts record with 4,490. He's got the most innings, and he's only 1 shutout behind Victor Starfin for that record as well. He's got 82, and Starfin had 83. What can you tell us about Kaneda?
I never met him. Apparently, he was called the Emperor not only because he dominated on the mound, but because of his personality. Very arrogant, controlling. He's famous as a manager. Am I allowed to use bad language?
Absolutely.
There's a story it shows up in the newest book by the umpire I interview for the book named Yamazaki, makes a call against Kaneda's team when Kaneda's a manager, and he comes out and he starts yelling at him, and he goes, "You stupid son of a," and so the umpire throws him out. Next day, Kaneda comes up to the umpire and goes, "I want to apologize to you. You went to a very prestigious university. You're not stupid. I should have just said you." So the umpire threw him out before the game even started.
Terrific.
Right. That's Kaneda. On the mound, brilliant. Right. We don't have the stats right in front of me, but did very well against the Major League All-Stars and teams that came over to play in Japan.
Isao Harimoto was a fascinating story. When he was 4 years old, he was in a terrible burn accident that left his 3 middle fingers on his dominant right hand basically useless. A year later, at the age of 5, he survived the Hiroshima nuclear bomb thanks to the fact that his childhood home was behind a hill that blocked most of the direct radiation, but he lost a sister who was in the blast zone. Harimoto has been identified as the only survivor of that incident to play professional baseball in Japan. His family moved from Korea right before he was born, and at the time, Japan was occupying Korea, and they had feuds going back hundreds of years. Despite his efforts to integrate into Japanese society, like changing his birth name to a Japanese name, Koreans were considered lower in society, especially in his childhood. Despite all of these challenges, he managed to teach himself how to become a lefty since his right hand never recovered from those burns, and he was the 1959 Pacific League Rookie of the Year and the 1962 Pacific League MVP. He went on to become the all-time hits leader in NPB with 3,085 in his 22-year career, which spanned from 1959 through 1981. In fact, no other player has been able to even pass 3,000. His 504 home runs are tied for 7th all-time, and he's one of only 3 professional baseball players in history with 3,000 hits, 500 home runs, and 300 stolen bases, along with Willie Mays and Alex Rodriguez. What can you tell us about Isao Harimoto?
Wow, you pretty much summed it up. Wow. I'll be honest, I don't have strong feelings about his personality that I've heard stories, or I don't recall any good tales to tell you about him. I think he was just a plain great ball player.
Yutaka Fukumoto is known as the Japanese Ricky Henderson, and in fact, Ricky Henderson actually gave and signed the base that he stole to break Fukumoto's record of 1,065 career steals. That base is now in the Japanese Baseball Hall of Fame. In 1972, he stole 106 bases and then went on to steal 95 and 94 in the next 2 seasons. What can you tell us about him?
So Fukumoto was more than just a base stealer. Like Henderson, he had some power. He was a good fielder, and he was a real spark plug of the team. So I think a comparison of Henderson is really apt. Marty Keenert, who was the first American GM in Japanese baseball history, said Fukuoka was the best player he ever saw. And he saw Otani, and he saw Ichiro.
Wow.
So Fukumoto was really a talented player. He led the Braves to a number of pennants and Japan World Series. He just played for the Hankyu Braves, which was nowhere near as prestigious a team as the Yomiuri Giants or the Hanshin Tigers. I do not know much about his personality. I don't hear stories about, oh, he was so funny or he was so arrogant. So I think he just did the job done and done it really well. And that's why he's not ranked as like he is ranked as one of the greatest players of all time. But if you asked modern Japanese fans, I bet you a lot of them don't remember who he is.
Interesting. Okay, we still have a lot to cover, and we haven't even gotten to the modern game yet, and we haven't mentioned any of the great Japanese players who have made the jump to American Major League Baseball. So let's take a break here because this kind of feels like a natural place to pause in the timeline, and we'll pick back up next episode where we left off. But before we leave, where can people go to either buy your latest book, In the Japanese Ballpark, or maybe one of your previous books, whether it's one that we've specifically talked about today or not?
There's really 2 ways. One is to go to my website, robfitz.com, and I'd be happy to sign it for you and send it off. And of course, there's always the evil empire, Amazon, which, usually can underprice me, and you can get it the next day.
But not signed.
But not signed.
And not supporting the author.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So for those listeners who don't mind paying shipping, I would always appreciate you go to my website. But if you want it right away, purchase it off of a local bookstore or even one of the big bookstores.
How can people follow you and reach out to you on social media to keep up with what you're doing these days and so they can see when you start promoting your 12th and 13th books? I'm
on social media a lot, but I don't produce a lot of new content on there. But one thing I have done, we haven't had a chance to talk about this, is I'm very active in SABR, the Society of American Baseball Research. So we have this committee called the Asian Baseball Research Committee, and we set it up almost 20 years ago. It's been very quiet up until recently. And now what we've decided to do in the past year is set up a blog, SABRAsianBaseball.com. And we try to produce content at least twice a week and sometimes 3 times a week of different articles about Asian baseball, not just Japan, Korea, Taiwan. We even had an article about Saudi Arabia, which is a little outside Asia, but close enough, we thought. And we emphasize not what's going on in the current season. So there's no stats or things like that. It's got to be either about history or culture.
Interesting.
And some of these articles are picked up elsewhere because we don't have enough to produce new content every week. But we're trying just to have it as a resource both for experts in the field and for people who are just learning. So
cool.
Try as much variety there as we possibly can.
Yeah, awesome. It really means a lot to me that you were willing to sit down with me today and help educate me further on a topic that's always been really compelling to me, but just too intimidating to start. But I hope that this episode or these couple episodes will be a great starting point for a number of fans who listen. So thank you very much.
Well, thanks, Dan. I love talking about Japanese baseball, so thank you.
Cool. Thanks, Rob.
All right.
If you think this episode has been worth even $1, please click the donate button in the upper right corner of our website, shoelesspodcast.com. That is a direct link to my PayPal profile where you can make a donation in any amount. If you don't have PayPal and want to send a donation through Venmo, Zelle, Cash App, or any other platform, shoot me an email at shoelesspodcast@gmail.com and I'll send you directions for whichever method you prefer. No amount is too small. It all adds up to allow us to keep creating this content for you year after year. And now it's time for a segment called What'd You Think, Mom?, where we talk to my mom who just listened to the interview with me, and we ask her what she thinks. This is my real, actual mom. Her name is Lori, but I've always just called her Mom. Can you say something to prove that you are my mom?
So it's been a minute since the first time you asked me that question, and we've gone places together. We've talked about lots of things, And today's episode really gave another whole layer of meaning to some of the things that we have experienced together these past 5 years. Specifically going to see the original site of Shibe Park and Connie Mack Stadium, and going to the Babe Ruth birthplace and museum. Put it on a whole geopolitical level of how important those two guys were. It's not just baseball. It's all coming together. Every episode, more and more things come together.
Yeah, that really is one of my favorite things about this podcast is everything can be related back to something else.
Yeah.
And all of baseball history is interwoven. You talk about baseball in another continent, in another century, and it's like, yeah, we talked about that guy before. We know this story intimately.
Right.
Once you start pulling the threads, they're all connected somewhere. With that being said, what did you think of part 1 of the Rob Fitz episode?
It's amazing how just one person or just a few people reappear in history over and over, and they pull things together and can affect change. We see it in the multiple times we hear the same names: Lefty O'Doul, Shariki, Cappy Harada. These 3 guys, over decades, they keep coming. They trust each other. They reach out to each other. They pull it together, and they do some major regrouping after major historic events. We'll talk about it in detail a little bit, but that's what I'm pulling out of this episode.
Yeah, I mean, Lefty O'Doul is a name that Americans just don't know anymore.
Right.
I think one of the gates at the Giants Stadium is called the Lefty O'Doul Gate because he played for the Giants for a while. But unless you know that, unless you go there and see that gate, he was a 2-time National League batting champion. He won a World Series. The first Major League Baseball All-Star game wasn't until 1933, and O'Doul's last year in the majors was 1934. But he was an All-Star at 36 years old in 1933, which is the same year that they won that World Series for the Giants. So he had a great career, but one that isn't really surprising to be largely forgotten 90 years later. But his impact on the game in Japan has absolutely not been forgotten. In 2002, he became the second American elected to the Japanese Baseball Hall of Fame after Wally Yonemine, whose name we're going to hear over and over and in part 2 as well. But like you said, I saw a meme recently that was like, everybody's so afraid to go back in time and change one thing because they might change the whole rest of the future timeline. But nobody realizes that maybe one thing that you do today can change history.
Absolutely.
And that is what Lefty O'Doul did, and that is what Cappy Harada did, and Shariki, and like all these guys. That was one of the things, it was so crazy to me. I know many people assume that baseball didn't start in Japan until after World War II. I personally knew that wasn't the case because I knew about the tour to Japan that Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig and Mo Berg went on in 1934. And as a White Sox fan and historian, like I also knew about the 1913 World Tour between the White Sox and the Giants, where they went to Japan. But to have Rob say that baseball was happening in Japan as far back as the 1870s.
That blew me away.
And then possibly now even as far back as the 1860s, they just haven't verified it yet. That was enlightening.
Right. It was absolutely mind-blowing because when we talk about when baseball was started here, it wasn't that much more before that.
Right.
So, and you're thinking, okay, how does that transfer over across an ocean? And when you see some photographs from Japan at that time, it is still so strongly a separate culture, separate clothing and customs and their gestures and their society rules and all that. And here they're exposed to baseball and they're adopting it, and just, it blew me away.
Yeah, I mentioned it in this part of the episode where Saber came out with the books for the 150th anniversary of baseball in Japan. And it's like, wait, what anniversary?
Yeah. Is that a typo?
Yeah, I think that was news to a lot of people who probably listened to this episode, that baseball has been going on for that long, and professional baseball for nearly a century now. We're 10 years away from professional baseball being in its 100th anniversary. And kind of along those same lines, when Rob was talking about Guy Green's barnstorming team playing throughout the Midwest in the early 1900s, he mentioned that at that time, America was kind of in a phase where they had this fascination with Japan and with Japanese culture and art and dress. And that's something kind of obscure, but you and I had previously learned that through our love of Frank Lloyd Wright. And
yes,
visiting homes that he was building around that time, that's something that we had heard, and that he had visited Japan, right?
Yes, he had commissions in Japan. He built the first earthquake hotel in, I believe, Tokyo, and that strongly influenced his designs throughout the rest of his life. Obviously, people were traveling and being greatly impacted by that. Yeah,
so again, another thing that unless you really sit there and think about it and put it together, you would never assume that those things are connected. And sure enough, you've got this guy who is in the Midwest in America and is like, I can sell some tickets if I just say these guys are from Japan. Everybody's into it right now.
We have talked about the 1934 tour before in different conversations, and it was one thing to think about the goodwill aspect of that and how much of an impression the Americans made to the Japanese people when they were there. It's great to see some of the photographs that you're going to have in the liner notes with that. And then to see how Babe Ruth came home and he had all these artifacts and souvenirs that he brought with to commemorate the time that he spent there. When we first talked about that, we didn't really necessarily talk in depth about what happens just a mere 7 years later. Mm-hmm. The world goes upside down. Mm-hmm. And Pearl Harbor happens and is such a shock. And of course, America comes into the Pacific Theater with World War II at that point. Listening to Rob talk about the setup, how we even got to the 1934 tour. It wasn't just that just happened. There were all these preceding events to get to that point so that you have the camaraderie built between, now they're coming back in 1934. They were there, they come back, relationships are being formed, people are being comfortable, more players are coming. You have Lefty O'Doul really forming a bond there, and then Pearl Harbor happens, and it's like a personal affront, a personal insult. We had heard the story about Babe Ruth and how he reacted, but anybody who was there, anybody on that team and how hurtful it could have been, obviously it's kind of silly to just think about how it impacted a handful of people when it is a global event. But it's so great to get both sides of the story. So we got the perspective of what was happening on the Japanese side and the American side.
Yeah, Rob retold a story that we had already heard before on this podcast when he talked about Babe Ruth feeling personally betrayed by Pearl Harbor and then throwing all those things that he brought home from his New York City apartment window. That's a story that we heard when Sean Hearn was on the show in a previous episode. Sean is the executive director of the Babe Ruth Birthplace and Museum in Baltimore, and they have some artifacts from Babe Ruth's personal collection that his wife and daughter kept that they either retrieved from the street or saved before Babe had a chance to throw them out the window. And they were amazing things, kimonos and plaques and pottery with his face on it and all these unbelievable things. So you could tell how endeared he was and how respected and revered he was by the Japanese. And it was clear that that feeling was mutual. So of course you can imagine how betrayed and heartbroken he must have been. I'm not sure if betrayed is necessarily the right word because it's not like he felt the Japanese government was doing it to Babe Ruth, But like you said, he felt like he had formed these bonds and everybody had come to an understanding that we're not that different. We all share this one thing in common. There's no reason for us to be dropping nuclear bombs on each other. This can bring us together. And then 7 years later, that's not how people felt anymore, apparently. So, yeah, of course, it must have been a shock to the system. And we kind of glossed over the number, but Babe Ruth bought $100,000 of war bonds. That is a lot of money. $100,000 in 1941 is the equivalent of $2.3 million today.
Wow, that's amazing.
That is a significant statement that he's making by buying those war bonds. Not that he couldn't afford it, but he put his money where his mouth is.
Right.
And not only that, spending his own money, but then going and playing in exhibition games and playing in benefit games and doing all sorts of appearances to raise money
going
on
on
top
the war
of
bond tour.
What he did. Yeah. So he took it personally and did something about it after the fact.
And it gets a little tricky because I think the bond is with the people and the attack is a governmental decision, higher up. But I think what the American players realized when they went over there is humanity is humanity and people are people. And if you find some common ground, which they obviously did, and that common ground was a baseball field, you can make that connection. And that's how you cross a bridge and shake hands and form a friendship that is lasting and can hopefully get you through those rough points. You asked Rob what he felt Lefty O'Doul's real feelings were about the relationships there. Rob said he really felt that Lefty just loved the Japanese people. They were his friends. That sets it up for when it's a time of healing and Cappy Harada reaches out to Lefty to say, what can we do to get things back on track? And they get together and come and play. They're at the field, the American flag goes up, anthem is sung. Japanese flag goes up, anthem is sung, and there's Cappy Harada standing up, saluting both of the flags side by side.
Mm-hmm.
That story brought me to tears because those two guys rose above. They rose above the two governments. You know, you're thinking you have an attack at Pearl Harbor, you have horrific battles in the Pacific, you have 2 atomic bombs being dropped, and they're on a baseball field and they pull it back together and they start the healing. That's a powerful moment.
And then after that, when Rob said, MacArthur made a statement that not only do I approve it, I applaud it, but then he also said, and I give it my permission. And I don't think that that's probably how it went down.
Maybe not.
I don't think that that is the true order of events. I don't think he said beforehand to Cappy Harada, I want you to do this, or if you do this, I'll be cool with it. I think Cappy Harada did that out of his own free will, and maybe not even thinking he was doing something impactful. It could have just been instinct that, like, the flags are going up, I'm saluting. This is what you do. And when MacArthur saw the impact that that was going to have, realized, okay, this moment is bigger than any petty differences.
Exactly.
I need to come out and say I'm behind it and stand behind my guy and be on his team.
Absolutely. And then here we go.
Yeah.
Now we're on the right path forward. I never knew what the translation for bonsai was. What a great salute to Babe Ruth. Now that I know that, obviously the book title was there. Didn't put that together till after finding out about it from Rob.
Yeah, that was one of the reasons I asked, because when I've heard him give other interviews and talk about that or reading it in the book, like, that's, again, a phrase that a lot of people are familiar with. Not necessarily Bonsai Babe Ruth, but just bonsai.
Right.
That's one of the reasons why at the beginning of the episode, I had him kind of run down the glossary of terms. And
yeah, that was very helpful.
Yeah. You know, there's a bar in Chicago, in Wrigleyville, called Nisei Lounge. And for years, I could have just Googled it this whole time. Like, what does this mean?
Well, not all the years, but yeah.
But once I did learn what it meant, I was like, oh, okay, cool. That's cool. And here's a platform that I can share that with a lot of other people, because I know we have a lot of listeners in Chicago, and I'm sure a lot of them have wondered what that means. And so now you know.
Yeah, and speaking of Chicago, the Curse of the Colonel, very close to the Chicago people with the Curse of Billy Goat. I liked the way they dredged up the Colonel and pulled him out, had a ceremony. They didn't dredge up the original goat, I don't believe, but they somehow came up with a similar path and victory in both ways. So good for both teams.
Well, they did that with the Steve Martin ball, you know, where they blew it up to break that curse.
Right.
I guess it worked. I don't know if it worked immediately, but the Cubs won a World Series after that. So
I can't hear enough about Mo Berg. I especially loved that Rob did the work and blew the myth by going and do the research. But now I'm even more intrigued by Mo Berg and what was that all about? Like, what was he up to? Because now we know that he wasn't sent there as a spy. It was just him. And I like the idea of, hey, this is pretty cool. I like this. I'm really going to do this. Now let's go.
Yeah, I think that's another kind of trend and theme that we saw in this episode, is that Rob does the research.
Yeah.
And has uncovered the true stories, or rediscovered, like, the Guy Green's team that had been lost to history, or figuring out that the earliest known baseball game in Japan may have been in 1869. Like, that's because he's going and doing the research to find out what's happening. And interesting that, like, he and I both have the collector mentality, and searching for things on eBay, you know, he finds that postcard and he's like, wait, what is this? And I can't tell you how many times that's happened to me for Shoeless Joe Jackson related things, where you see an old newspaper, like, because obviously if you have a newspapers.com subscription, you can look up any newspaper in the world, but are you just randomly typing in a date and a city and being like, I wonder what's on this date? I hope it's Joe Jackson related. Like, no. But if somebody lists some random newspaper on eBay that names Joe Jackson or has his picture, you might read a story that you've never heard before. And so, like I said, I can't tell you the number of times that that has happened.
Right.
And led me down a path of, like, oh, wow, this is incredible. And for Rob to be, like, one of the only American Japanese baseball scholars, and having the personal connection to be able to talk to these people, and he's been there before, and his wife speaks the language, and, like, the way everything came together for him was an interesting story in and of itself.
Absolutely. It's great timing, because now we see Japanese players coming to the forefront on some of the main teams in American baseball. It's a very timely conversation to be having.
Yeah, I kind of abruptly ended the interview portion of this episode because he and I recorded in one shot the long interview. but the unabridged version will air in the next episode where I really explain to him why it was so important for me to talk to him now. And those are all of the reasons,
Right.
the fact that it's so topical right now, and the World Baseball Classic was happening. I knew I was going to be watching Japan play multiple games there, and the White Sox signed the biggest Japanese free agent this offseason, who, by the way, is on pace to set the American League home run record in his rookie season.
How about that?
So yeah, there are many reasons why this was the perfect time to talk to Rob, and I'm thrilled that he was willing to sit down and give me as much time as he did. I've never done a 2-part episode, and I didn't go into this one expecting this to be a 2-part episode, but once he and I got talking and he was giving me these long, thoughtful answers, he wasn't giving me 2 words here and there. Like, he saw the research that I did to be prepared, and he gave me that much time back. So could not be more grateful for the way he made this episode what it turned out to be. And it's 2 episodes. So
Right.
Come back next month and we will talk about the modern game, basically from 1965 to today, and talk a lot about his new book, In the Japanese Ballpark, which talks about the in-game experience when you go to a game in Japan. Lots of differences between America and Japan when it comes to that, from the way that people cheer to the way that concessions are sold and all sorts of things. So it's an exciting listen for the next episode as well.
I think I really would have liked watching Wally Yonamine play. I want to see him take out a second baseman to avoid the double play. We've had some White Sox players who, would be doing that too, but I like that he was that guy. And I like that, again, one person kind of changed the direction, changed the strategy of how that whole country played baseball. Very cool.
Yeah, and the very first story in the next part of the episode is another similar thing, that like one decision, one action changed the course of history for the next 30 years. So it is interesting how that continues to happen. Okay, thanks, Mom.
Thanks, Dan.
Okay, so that's it. In the introduction of this episode, I mentioned how there are a handful of ways for you to follow the podcast online. In addition to liking, subscribing, and giving My Baseball History a 5-star rating on your favorite podcast app, please make sure you're also following us on Facebook, Blue Sky, Twitter, and Instagram, where we are at Shoeless Podcast on each platform. By following us there, you'll get some bonus content throughout the month, including daily posts detailing an important event which happened on this day in baseball history. You'll also be able to interact with us to let us know what you think of the show. If you're a fan of some more long-form posts, you can sign up for Clearing the Bases, our email newsletter, by heading to shoelesspodcast.substack.com. We publish 2 newsletters a month, which allow us to talk about lots of things we don't normally talk about on the show. I use that space to talk about the podcast, of course, but I also use it to write about baseball road trips I go on, to publish research I do, and to speak on current events in baseball, all of which are things I don't really do in episodes of My Baseball History. Look for a new issue to be published on the 2nd Friday and the 4th Friday of every month. If you have questions about the podcast or research you'd like to contribute to a future newsletter, submit something through the contact form on our website or email us at shoelesspodcast@gmail.com. Before the interview with Rob, I mentioned a trivia question you can answer to win something, and here's how you can do that. First, make sure you're following us on Twitter or Blue Sky at shoelesspodcast. Then, find the pinned post at the top of our profile with the link to part 1 of the Robert K. Fitz episode, which asks this episode's trivia question. The answer to the trivia question was somewhere in the episode that you just finished listening to. Quote that post along with your answer, and you'll automatically be entered. We'll pick one person who answered correctly, and they'll win a copy of Rob's 2013 Seymour Medal award-winning book, Bonsai Babe Ruth: Baseball, Espionage, and Assassination During the 1934 Tour of Japan. A tale of international intrigue, attempted murder, and, of course, baseball, Bonsai Babe Ruth is the first detailed account of the doomed attempt to reconcile the United States and Japan through the 1934 All-American Baseball Tour. We'll reach out to the winner before the next episode of the podcast goes live. You don't have to be the first person to answer, you just have to answer correctly, but make sure you're actually following us on your preferred social media platform or your entry won't be counted. If you enjoyed what you've heard so far today, stay tuned for the second part of this interview with Rob, which will go live on Wednesday, June 10th, and will be the final episode of Season 5 of My Baseball History. Like I mentioned in the introduction of this episode, that part will cover the modern game, everything from 1964 to today, with a focus on the in-game experience in the Japanese ballpark if you were going to go there today. And like in many episodes of this podcast, we'll talk about a bunch of players you know well, and hopefully introduce you to the names and stories of a handful of people you've never heard of at all. Don't forget, it's a huge help when you rate and review My Baseball History wherever you listen to the podcast. 5-star ratings help our show get featured on more people's suggested podcast pages, which means that more people will have a chance to discover it. It just takes a couple seconds of your time, but it really helps us a lot. And of course, liking us on social media, interacting with our posts, and sharing things with your friends or family is great too. Feel free to send this episode to anyone in your life who loves baseball or Babe Ruth. Hopefully they'll enjoy it, and maybe they'll even learn a thing or two. But no matter how you choose to support us, even if it's just by listening, we appreciate you being here. Until next time, I'm Dan Wallach, and this is My Baseball History.